The night had fallen quietly, the trees whispering in the wind as I sat by the campfire, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows across the campsite. It was one of those rare moments when I felt completely at peace, away from the noise of everyday life. I had been planning this trip for months, the perfect escape into the wilderness. A few friends had backed out at the last minute, but I decided to go alone anyway. I wasn't scared of being out there on my own. I had been camping alone before. I liked the solitude, the quiet that only nature could offer. But I didn't know then how much that silence would weigh on me. I set up camp on a small clearing deep in the forest, a few miles off any trail. There were no other campers around, no signs of human life for miles, just the trees and the open sky above. I had everything I needed: my tent, a sleeping bag, a good stove, some food, and a water filter. I set up my camp with care, making sure everything was in order, even if I was the only one here to appreciate it. I didn't want to take any chances. This was as wild as it gets. No one else nearby to help if something went wrong. The first few hours were uneventful. I cooked some simple food, enjoyed the warmth of the fire, and watched the stars start to peek out as the sky darkened. There was something special about the stillness. Felt like the world had stopped, and for a while I could just be. I never expected that something so simple, so normal, would take such a strange turn. As the fire began to die down, I could hear the rustling of leaves in the distance. First, I didn't think much of it. Animals are common around here, and the wind had started picking up. But then, the rustling grew louder, and it wasn't the sound of small creatures moving through the brush. This was different. The sound was heavier, more deliberate, like something larger was making its way through the forest, moving closer to my camp. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, something harmless. But then the rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. I stared into the darkness, straining to hear anything, my senses heightened. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was my own breath. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the forest around me had grown unnaturally still. No crickets, no birds, no animals, nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard it. A twig snapped in the distance. I couldn't tell where it came from. I turned my head, scanning the shadows of the trees. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, flicked it on, and shined it around the campsite, trying to pierce the darkness. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing only the trees, the tent, and my small campfire, now reduced to glowing embers. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't felt this uneasy in the wild before. There was a tension in the air, a sense that I wasn't alone, and that thought started gnawing at me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just overthinking it. I got up to stoke the fire, tossing a few more logs onto the flames. As the fire grew brighter, I thought I saw something move in the distance. Just for a second, a figure tall and thin, standing motionless behind the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I wasn't sure if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely. It didn't seem right. It didn't move like anything natural. But when I blinked, it was gone. The forest once again swallowed up everything, leaving me alone with nothing but the crackling of the fire. I decided to go inside my tent, hoping that sleep would give me some relief. Maybe I was just exhausted. The wind outside had picked up again, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest. That's what it was like out here. It was natural to feel on edge. But as the hours passed, I began to wonder if I was imagining things. Was I hearing footsteps? The same heavy thud I had heard earlier? Was there someone out there, circling my camp, waiting for me to make a move? I got out of my sleeping bag and grabbed the flashlight again, stepping outside the tent. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily silent again. I couldn't see anything, but I had this gut feeling that something was watching me, something that didn't belong. I scanned the area once more, but there was no movement, no sign of life, nothing. But as I turned to go back into the tent, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, not loud, not human. It was like a whisper, barely audible, but it came from behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart racing. But again, there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the trees swaying in the wind. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. I was starting to lose it. But even as I said that, the unease in my gut only grew stronger. I went back into the tent, trying to force myself to relax. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already so late. The hike out of the forest would take hours, and I wasn't about to navigate unfamiliar terrain in the dark. Plus, I kept telling myself that nothing had happened. There was no reason to panic. I had camped out here plenty of times before. I was fine, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little noise outside, every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig sent me into a frenzy. I sat up in my tent, holding the flashlight in my trembling hands. I felt the air growing colder, and my breath fogged up in front of me. It wasn't this cold earlier. Then I heard something else. A low growl. It was distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't an animal I recognized. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to get out of there. I had never been so scared in my life. I grabbed my backpack, shoving everything into it in a frantic hurry. I had to leave. I didn't care how far I had to go. I couldn't stay here anymore. I pushed my way out of the tent, holding my flashlight in front of me. The night felt alive with movement. I shined the light around, expecting to see something in the trees. But there was nothing. Still nothing. My mind was racing. Was I just losing it? Then, just as I was about to turn around and make a run for it, I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps getting closer. I spun around, ready to face whatever it was, but there was nothing. The forest was silent again, as though it had never been disturbed. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my gear and started running. The path was difficult to follow, but I didn't care. I was panicking, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks, not even stopping to think about where I was going. All that mattered was getting out of that forest. I didn't stop running until I hit the main trail. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. The sounds of the forest, the eerie whispers and growls were gone. I didn't care to look back. I just kept walking, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was rising. I was exhausted, but I was alive. I hadn't realized until that moment how close I had come to something I couldn't explain. Something that wasn't right. I never went back to that spot in the woods, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are meant to stay unexplored, and some experiences, no matter how strange or frightening, are best left behind, in the darkness where they belong. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip, just a simple getaway to clear my head. I hadn't been out in the woods for a while, and the thought of being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, seemed perfect. The kind of peace you only get when you're miles away from the hustle of city life. I packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, a couple of knives, a first aid kit, and a lighter. That was all I thought I'd need. I arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The sun was shining bright, but there was a cool breeze that made the air feel fresh. The forest seemed quiet, the kind of quiet that you can only experience when you're far from civilization. I chose a spot by a small creek. It seemed perfect. The sound of the water flowing would keep me company, and the view of the trees was just breathtaking. Setting up my tent didn't take long. I'm not the most experienced camper, but I've done enough trips to know how to handle the basics. I laid everything out, unpacked my food, and got the fire pit ready. The logs were dry, and the kindling lit up quickly. The flames were small but steady, and I leaned back on a rock, watching as the fire flickered. As the sun began to set, the forest took on a different feeling. The warm light from the fire contrasted with the growing shadows, making everything feel more isolated, more remote. I thought about going for a walk, but something about the quietness made me hesitate. It was like the forest was watching me, but I shrugged off the feeling. I didn't want to be paranoid. After all, it was just a forest. I spent the evening eating and enjoying the solitude. The crackling of the fire was the only sound for miles, and I could feel myself finally relaxing. But as night crept in, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the leaves, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Maybe it was an animal, but it didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. It was a strange, almost deliberate sound, like something was moving around the campsite, trying to stay hidden. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, so I decided to go to bed early. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to get comfortable. The air was cool, and the fabric of the tent wasn't enough to keep it from creeping in. I pulled my sleeping bag up over my head, trying to block out the chill, but sleep wasn't coming easily. Every small noise outside made me tense up. The wind, the creak, the rustling of leaves, it all seemed louder than usual, and there was that distant snapping sound again. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I drifted off to sleep. But the peace didn't last. I woke up later to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or the usual sounds of animals. No, this was different. It was too close, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening intently. It was moving around the campsite, circling the area, but always just out of sight. My heart began to race. I reached for the flashlight next to me, but then the sound stopped. I lay there, wide awake now, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced with thoughts. Could it be another camper? Maybe someone was lost or stranded. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest campsite was miles away, and I had seen no other cars when I arrived. Then the silence hit. It was absolute. No more rustling leaves, no more distant snaps, just the sound of my own breathing. I stayed still, trying not to make a sound. I knew I had to wait until morning. I couldn't afford to make a wrong move, not with whatever was out there. Slowly, I let my eyes close again, forcing myself to relax, but it was impossible to fall back asleep. My mind wouldn't let me. Minutes felt like hours, and then, just when I thought I might go mad from the silence, the sound returned. But this time it was closer. I could hear the footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching over the underbrush. It was walking right around my tent. My pulse quickened. My breath caught in my throat. There was something unnerving about the way it moved, deliberate and slow, as if it knew I was inside and wanted me to know it. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it through the fabric of the tent. The light barely made it through the thick material, but I swore I saw something move in the shadows, something large. I held my breath, hoping it would go away, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued circling the tent, and I could feel the air shift, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I don't know how long I stayed like that, terrified and waiting for whatever it was to move on. But it didn't. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent slowly, making sure not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crept outside, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The forest around me was dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The creek's gentle flow was the only sound. I scanned the area, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I didn't see anything at first. No movement, no sign of anything nearby. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was suffocating, the air thick with tension. I turned around in a slow circle, scanning the edges of the forest, the darkened shadows between the trees. Then I caught a glimpse of something, a shape, just beyond the light's reach. I froze. The shape was moving, something big and dark, But it wasn't an animal. I could tell it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too controlled. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back to the tent and pack up as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching as the shape took a step closer. Suddenly, I heard it heavy breathing. Not mine, but something else's. It was coming from the direction of the shape, deep in the trees. My blood ran cold. That was it. I wasn't alone. In a panic, I turned and bolted toward my tent, heart hammering in my chest. I ripped open the zipper, threw myself inside, and scrambled to grab my backpack. I had to get out of there. As I was frantically trying to pack, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, quickening now, like something was chasing me. I didn't stop to look. Couldn't. I grabbed my stuff, shoved it into my pack, and sprinted out of the tent, running toward the trailhead. The darkness felt endless as I ran, my breath coming in short gasps. The only thing I could focus on was getting back to my car, which felt miles away. The sounds of footsteps behind me grew louder, but I didn't dare turn around. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept pushing forward. The trees blurred as I sprinted down the trail, barely able to see in the pitch-black night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the outline of my car in the distance. The headlights seemed like a beacon in the dark. I pushed myself harder, the light growing closer with each step. I reached the car, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. For a long moment, I just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. As I sat there in the car, still shaking, I realized how close I had come. Whatever was out there in the woods, it hadn't been just an animal. I could still hear the faint sound of something moving in the distance, but I didn't care. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. I started the engine, pulled out of the campsite, and drove away, not looking back. The eerie feeling didn't leave me, though. I couldn't shake the sense that something had been watching me, something that knew I was there. When I got back to the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station to catch my breath and check my gear. I didn't see anything unusual, but the memory of those footsteps, the strange shape in the woods, and the heavy breathing kept replaying in my mind. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp alone again. It was a late Friday afternoon when I decided to go camping alone. I'd been working nonstop for weeks, and the thought of escaping into the woods sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. I had everything packed: my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, food, and a flashlight. Nothing too fancy, just enough to get me through a weekend of solitude in the forest. I wasn't far from the nearest town, but far enough to feel completely disconnected from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The trail I chose was well known but not too crowded. I'd been on it once before, years ago, with some friends. The weather was perfect, a crisp chill in the air with the promise of a clear night sky. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as I made my way down the familiar path, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound I could hear. After an hour of walking, I found a small clearing near a creek. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and I figured it would be a great spot to set up camp. I unpacked my things and set up the tent quickly. The forest around me was dense, with towering trees whose branches swayed gently in the wind. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long, and the forest grew quieter, almost too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of the creek and the occasional breeze. As night fell, I made a small fire. The warmth was comforting against the cool night air, and I sat in front of it, roasting marshmallows and staring into the flames. The firelight flickered and danced on the trees around me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. But it wasn't anything to be concerned about. I'd been camping plenty of times before and knew how the fire could play tricks on the mind. The hours passed slowly, and before I knew it, the stars were out in full force. I finished my meal, cleaned up the campsite, and crawled into the tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and I quickly drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had roused me, but there was a strange sensation in the air, like something was off. The fire had long since burned out, and all I could hear now was the distant sound of the creek. For a moment, I listened carefully, straining to hear anything that might explain why I was awake. But there was nothing, just the wind whispering through the trees. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was impossible. My mind kept racing, thinking I'd heard something, though I couldn't say what. A snap of a twig? A rustle in the leaves? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally decided to get up and check it out. I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to make too much noise. The air outside was cold, but the sky was clear, and the moonlight illuminated the clearing. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the forest around me. The shadows seemed deeper now, and the stillness was unsettling. I didn't hear any animal noises like I usually would at night. No rustling of leaves, no calls from owls or coyotes. It was dead silent. I stepped away from the tent and walked a little closer to the creek. The water was flowing smoothly, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. I knelt down to wash my face, the cold water sending a shock through my body. The chill helped clear my head, and I stood up, about to return to the tent, when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the treeline. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He was tall, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. I couldn't see his face, but I could make out the outline of his body. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching me. For a long moment, I stood perfectly still, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe he was another camper, though that didn't make much sense. There weren't any other campsites around, and if he had been on the trail, I would have heard him approach. I called out softly, my voice shaky, "Hello!" No response. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, but I tried to calm myself. He might be lost or just a hiker who had wandered off the path. But then, something felt off. The way he stood so still, like he wasn't even aware of the world around him. It felt wrong. I took a cautious step back, then another and another. Each step felt heavier than the last, my feet sinking into the soft earth beneath me. I never took my eyes off the figure, though I couldn't see him clearly enough to make out any details. Just a dark shape standing motionless in the shadows. I stumbled back to the tent, trying to keep my movements slow and quiet. Once I was inside, I zipped it up as fast as I could, my hands trembling. I sat there for a moment, my heart still racing, listening intently. The sounds of the forest seemed to return, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of branches. But I didn't hear anything that would suggest the figure had moved. I lay there, wide awake, listening for any sign that he was still out there. Every creak of the tent, every snap of a twig, sent me into a fit of anxiety. My mind kept running through different scenarios, all of them equally terrifying. What if he was just waiting out there? What if he was waiting for me to fall asleep? Hours seemed to pass, though I didn't dare check the time. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the fear squeezing the air out of my lungs. But eventually, exhaustion took over. My eyes fluttered shut, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The morning light broke through the trees, casting a warm glow on the campsite. I woke up with a start, disoriented and groggy. The events of the night flooded back to me, and I immediately scanned the area around me. The forest was calm now, peaceful even. No sign of the figure, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I packed up my things quickly, moving as quietly as I could, not wanting to attract any attention. By the time I was done, the sun was fully up, and the world around me seemed normal again. The creek flowed gently, birds chirped in the distance, and the air was fresh and crisp. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I hadn't imagined the figure. I knew what I had seen, but now there was no sign of him. It was as though he had never been there at all. I decided to leave the campsite. The experience had rattled me, and I didn't feel comfortable staying any longer. I made my way back down the trail, retracing my steps from the night before. The forest seemed different now, quieter, more oppressive. But eventually, I made it back to the parking lot where my car was waiting. I threw my gear in the back seat and started the engine, relieved to be leaving. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me as I left. But there was nothing, just the road stretching out before me and the forest disappearing into the distance. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. There was something in the air that night, something that I couldn't quite put into words. But in the end, I was safe, and that was what mattered most. The forest was behind me now, and I was heading home, where things were normal again. No strange figures, no eerie silence, just the world I knew and the comfort of being back in it. It was over, and for the first time since I'd set up camp, I could finally breathe again. It was the perfect weekend for camping. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The weather was just right, cool enough for a campfire, but not so cold that I'd need a jacket. I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, a few snacks, and of course, the essentials for a good time in the wilderness. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from the usual camping grounds. It felt like the kind of place where I could just disconnect from everything and enjoy some peace and quiet. I arrived at the site in the late afternoon. The forest was dense, with towering pine trees that created a canopy above, letting only small beams of sunlight through. The ground was soft and spongy with layers of pine needles, and the air smelled fresh, like earth and pine resin. It was quiet too. No birds singing, no rustling animals. Just the sound of the wind gently moving through the trees. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent quickly, making sure it was far enough from the small creek that ran nearby. It wasn't much of a creek, more like a slow-moving stream, but the sound of water would be soothing as I settled in for the night. I arranged my things inside the tent, organizing the few comforts I brought. A flashlight, my phone, which I would only use if necessary, and a book for the night. As I finished, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. I started a small fire, its flames crackling as they danced in the cool evening air. The warmth was comforting, and I sat there, staring into the fire, not thinking about much. It was just one of those moments when everything felt right. There was a gentle breeze now and then, and the flickering of the fire made the surrounding trees look like they were alive, stretching and swaying with every gust of wind. It wasn't until later, as the night began to settle in, that I started to notice something strange. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful at first, now felt different. It was subtle, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The breeze had stopped. The crackling of the fire became the only sound in the entire forest. I could hear my own heartbeat, a little louder than usual, and it made me uneasy. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I took a deep breath and stared up at the stars, which were now visible through the gaps in the tree branches. It was beautiful. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed brighter than I had ever seen them. But then, just as I was about to lie back and relax, I heard something, a faint sound, a rustling. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a deer. The forest was full of life after all. But the sound continued. It wasn't the kind of noise that an animal would make. It was almost deliberate, like something was moving through the brush, slowly and carefully. I sat up, straining my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the creek. It was hard to tell how far away it was, but it sounded close enough to make me feel uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The rustling stopped. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to get up and check out the area around the creek. The night was pitch black now, and I had to keep the flashlight in front of me, the beam cutting through the trees. The air had gotten colder, and a light fog began to form, clinging to the ground and making everything look even more eerie. I walked toward the creek, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. The rustling sound was gone, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. When I reached the creek, I stopped and listened. Everything was quiet again. I shone my flashlight over the water, which was now moving a little faster than it had earlier. I could see the occasional fish darting in the shallows, but nothing else seemed out of place. I walked along the creek for a few minutes, my mind racing with thoughts of what it could have been. Maybe it was just an animal, I kept telling myself, but something about the way the rustling had stopped so suddenly still didn't sit right with me. I decided to head back to camp. The fire was still going, but it seemed smaller now, its warmth no longer as comforting as it had been. As I made my way back, the fog had thickened, and the trees around me seemed to grow darker and more foreboding. I quickened my pace, almost running, but the harder I tried to push through the fog, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by it. When I finally reached the clearing, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The fire crackled softly, and my tent stood just where I had left it. I felt a brief moment of relief, but that strange feeling, the one that something wasn't quite right, lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to stay awake for a little longer, just in case. The more I thought about it, the more my mind started to race. What if someone else was out here? I was deep in the forest, after all, far from any other campsites. The thought of another person, someone unfamiliar, out there in the dark was unsettling. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just nerves, but the feeling didn't go away. I sat next to the fire for hours, watching the flames flicker and crackle. The fog grew thicker, and I could barely make out the trees around me. Felt like the forest had swallowed me whole. The moon had risen higher in the sky, casting pale light through the fog, but it only added to the eerie atmosphere. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., when I finally decided to get some sleep. I doused the fire, its glowing embers flickering out as I made my way into the tent. I zipped it up, cocooning myself inside, and lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling of the tent. The air was still, the only sound the distant rush of the creek and the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. But as I lay there, trying to relax, I heard something again. A soft rustling sound, this time closer than before. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was outside the tent, moving around in the brush. I held my breath, listening closely. The rustling stopped for a moment, and then I heard a footstep, a faint crunch of leaves and twigs. I sat up quickly, my pulse racing. I could feel my chest tighten as fear started to take hold. The noise was right outside my tent now, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I grabbed my flashlight and held it tightly in my hand. I knew I needed to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help, but the fear was overwhelming. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a person, a wild animal, or something else? I stayed perfectly still, hoping that whatever it was would move away, but the rustling continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was trying to stay quiet. I felt trapped. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could think was to wait until morning, but that seemed impossible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Complete silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath, waiting for the slightest sound. But there was nothing. It was as though the forest itself had gone dead silent. I was terrified to move, to even breathe too loudly. The fear had taken over completely, and I didn't know what to do next. After what felt like hours, the silence was broken by a single, faint sound. A distant call, like the wind, but different. It was almost calming. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fog had lifted slightly, and the first light of dawn was beginning to break through. The trees looked normal again, not so menacing. I felt a sense of relief, though the fear still lingered. I stepped out of the tent, my legs unsteady beneath me. The campfire was long gone, just a few smoldering embers left behind. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that didn't feel threatening anymore. It was just peaceful. The birds were starting to wake, and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush resumed. I took a deep breath and realized something. Whatever had happened, whatever I had heard or felt, it didn't matter now. The night was over, and the forest was once again a place of peace. I packed up my things slowly, trying to shake off the lingering tension. As I made my way back to the trail, the sun was fully up, casting a warm light over the forest. The path out was clear, and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It was a strange night, one I wouldn't forget, but in the end, I made it through. The forest didn't swallow me, and whatever was out there never came closer. The world was still there, as calm and peaceful as it had always been. I would definitely be back, but next time I might pick a more populated site, just in case. I remember the day I set off for the camping trip like it was yesterday. The sun was high in the sky, and I felt the familiar excitement in my chest as I packed my things. It wasn't a big trip, just me, a tent, and the usual camping gear. A sleeping bag, food for a couple of days, a flashlight, some spare batteries, and my old backpack. I had chosen a spot a few hours outside of town, deep in the woods, far enough from civilization that I could enjoy the quiet, but close enough that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. I was used to being alone. I didn't mind it. The calm of nature was the perfect escape from the noise of daily life. The trail I planned to hike was a familiar one I'd done a few times before. It wasn't too difficult, but it wasn't easy either. It was the kind of hike that took you through varied terrain, rocky paths, muddy stretches, and thick forests. And after the long hike, the reward was always a small, quiet clearing near a stream where I could set up camp. That day, however, things didn't go exactly as planned. It wasn't anything too dramatic at first. The hike was as usual, nothing out of the ordinary. I made my way up the trail, the only sounds around me being the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with a gentle breeze that made the leaves shimmer. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it got. And while most people might have felt uneasy about the silence, I welcomed it. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent by the stream, the sound of the water a calming background to my work. It took me a little longer than usual to set everything up, as I was still adjusting to the heavier gear I had brought this time. I'd planned to stay out here for a few days, so I'd brought extra food and supplies. When everything was set, I made a small fire to cook my dinner. There's something about cooking over an open flame that feels right when you're in the wild. The smell of the food, the warmth of the fire against the growing chill of the night, and the steady crackle of burning wood, it all made the day's hike feel worth it. As I ate, I looked up at the sky, the stars starting to appear as the sky turned dark. I didn't realize how much time had passed until the fire was starting to die down. The wind had picked up a little, making the branches above me sway and creak. It was just the kind of night when everything felt still and calm, yet at the same time there was this underlying tension in the air. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but something felt off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was just the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it and decided to settle into my tent for the night. I had my flashlight, but the soft glow from the fire was enough for now. The wind outside continued to rustle the trees, and every now and then, a twig would snap, sending my mind racing to imagine what kind of animal might be lurking just beyond the reach of my sight. Eventually, the night grew colder, and I snuffed out the fire, leaving only the embers to slowly fade away. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth from it comforting as I tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the strange feeling from earlier. It wasn't long before I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. A twig snapped. It was sharp, loud, and too close. I froze, holding my breath. The wind hadn't made that noise. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. I listened carefully, straining to hear any further sounds. Nothing, just the wind, and then the distant call of an owl. But that was it. No other movement. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. Another snap of a twig, even closer this time. This time I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered through the small opening of the tent. There was nothing. The shadows were thick, and the trees stood silent, as if mocking my fear. I lay back down, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, listening to every little sound, trying to make sense of it. The wind had picked up again, but it didn't help. It only made the branches creak and groan louder, distorting every little sound. Around midnight, I finally drifted off to sleep, but it was fitful, filled with dreams of shadows and whispers that didn't belong in the forest. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the first hint of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The fire was just a pile of cold ashes now, and the world outside the tent was quiet again. But the feeling didn't leave me. Something was off. I packed up my things slowly, making sure I didn't leave anything behind, then decided to hike back to the main trail. I figured a change of scenery would help clear my head. The hike back felt different. The woods, which had once been calming, now seemed imposing. Every sound, every rustle in the trees, made me tense. I told myself it was just the adrenaline from the night's weird experience, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I walked, I found myself moving faster, trying to cover more ground. The trail felt longer than it ever had before, and every time I turned a corner, the forest seemed to close in on me. It felt like the trees were pressing in, their branches reaching out to grab me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. The path began to narrow, and the forest around me grew thicker. The light had changed, and the air felt heavier. Then I heard it, footsteps, slow, steady, and deliberate. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was close, too close. I looked around, my mind racing. There was no one in sight. No one had passed me, and yet the footsteps continued. It wasn't an animal either. The rhythm of the steps was too distinct, too human. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to gather the courage to move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to keep walking. The steps followed. I quickened my pace, my breathing shallow and erratic. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was no one there, but the sound kept following me. It was like a constant presence, a shadow that wouldn't leave. The more I walked, the more desperate I became. My mind was filled with scenarios. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who had gotten lost, or someone who was deliberately following me. The logical part of me wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking it, but the fear in my chest told me otherwise. Finally, I reached the main trail, the one that led back to the parking lot. I didn't dare stop to look back. I just kept moving, faster now, until I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked. I didn't stop until I was inside, the doors locked, and the engine roaring to life. I left the woods behind me as quickly as I could, the feeling of being watched slowly fading the further I drove. When I finally made it back to the safety of my home, I thought about the strange events of that night, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until I started unpacking my gear that I found something I hadn't noticed before. A single boot print, fresh in the dirt near my tent. It was huge, far too large to be my own. I never went back to that camping spot, and I never will. It was the beginning of summer, and I decided to take a weekend trip into the woods. I had been feeling cooped up, surrounded by the noise of city life, and the thought of getting away to a secluded spot for a few days sounded like the perfect escape. I packed up my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, and all the essentials, and drove out to a campground I had heard about from a friend. It was remote, nestled deep in the woods, far away from the usual tourist spots. The drive was peaceful, the kind of quiet that felt like a breath of fresh air after a long week of work. I passed by small towns, winding roads, and green fields until I reached the edge of the forest. The campground was tucked behind a thick line of trees, and the moment I turned off the main road and onto the dirt trail that led to the site, I felt like I was entering another world. The forest was dense, the canopy of leaves overhead blocking out most of the light. I could hear birds calling in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of twigs beneath my feet. It felt calm, serene, even, but there was a hint of something else in the air, a subtle tension that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I arrived at the campground, there was no one else around. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet. The spot I chose was near a small creek that ran through the area, the sound of water trickling over rocks adding to the peaceful atmosphere. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and made a small fire. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. As I sat by the fire, roasting some marshmallows and watching the flames dance, I couldn't help but notice how isolated I felt. There were no other campers, no sounds of nearby voices or movement, just the quiet hum of nature. At first, I thought it was a good thing, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, but as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. It was nothing specific, just a general feeling of discomfort, as though I wasn't truly alone. The first sign that something was off came when I heard a faint noise behind me, a rustling, almost like footsteps on the leaves. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No animals, no other campers, just the darkening woods. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a squirrel or a deer, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I shook it off and went back to my fire, but I couldn't help but feel that the woods were closing in around me, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. Night fully fell and the temperature dropped. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth a comfort against the cold air. The crackling of the fire was the only sound as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to shake the sense of unease. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like it was directed at me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then I heard it again, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. My heart skipped a beat. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to listen. There was nothing for a few moments, then another thud. This time, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I peered out of the tent. I saw nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fallen branch or something moving in the underbrush. But the longer I stayed there, the more I became convinced that whatever it wasn't natural. The sounds didn't stop. Every so often, I'd hear the faint thud again, followed by what sounded like something scraping against the ground. It was like someone or something was walking just outside the perimeter of the campsite, staying just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then the noises came closer, much closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. I couldn't sit there and wait any longer. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night air hit me like a punch to the chest, cold and sharp. I swept the beam of light across the area, scanning the trees and the underbrush for any sign of movement. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard the noise again. It was definitely closer now, just beyond the trees. I took a step forward, my breath shallow and quick. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct told me to run. But I had to know what was out there. I moved cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground. The forest around me was eerily quiet, the sounds of nature gone, replaced by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I reached the edge of the tree line and paused. The noise had stopped, but I could feel something in the air, a heaviness, a tension that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a branch snapping in two, and I whipped around, shining my light in that direction. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. Just for a split second, I thought I saw a figure, tall, thin, and dark, darting between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, moving quickly, almost as though it didn't belong. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, eyes wide, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. And then the sound came again, this time much closer. I turned, and there it was, a shadow in the corner of my vision, moving through the trees with impossible speed. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any features, but I knew whatever it was not friendly. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward my tent. My breath was ragged, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. The sound of footsteps, real human footsteps, followed me. Whoever or whatever was out there was chasing me. I reached the camp and scrambled into my tent, heart racing, hands shaking as I zipped it shut. I pressed my back against the wall of the tent, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe more. The world outside was silent, the only sound my racing heartbeat. Slowly, the tension in my body started to ease, though the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I kept my flashlight on, pointed at the door, ready to shine it if anything tried to get in. Eventually, I managed to calm myself enough to think. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't a person. I was sure of that now, but what was it? And why had it been watching me? I didn't know, but I knew I wasn't staying another night. The next morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I didn't dare go back to the creek to wash up, didn't dare linger longer than necessary. The woods felt oppressive now, like they were holding something back, something dangerous. I didn't want to find out what it was. I drove back home, heart still pounding, but I didn't feel truly safe until I was back in the familiar comfort of my apartment. I haven't been camping since. Some things are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend camping trip, a way to escape the noise of city life and reconnect with nature. I'd been planning it for weeks, gathering all the camping gear, making sure everything was ready for a few days in the woods. My friends had all backed out, citing everything from work to personal issues, so I decided to go alone. It wasn't the first time I'd camped solo, and I liked the idea of having some peace and quiet in the wilderness. Little did I know, this trip would be far from peaceful. I had arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. It was a remote location, a few miles off the main trail, which was perfect. There weren't many people who ventured that far into the woods. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and started unloading my gear. It was a fairly simple setup, just a tent, sleeping bag, some food, and my hiking boots. I didn't plan on doing much hiking this time, just enjoying the solitude and the crackling campfire under the stars. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees as I started to set up my tent. The forest was eerily quiet, not even the usual chirping of birds or rustling of small animals. It wasn't unusual for places like this to feel still, but it made me uneasy. I kept glancing around, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, it was just me out here, and nothing had happened yet. As night approached, I lit the campfire. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows against the trees around me. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made you want to curl up in your sleeping bag and forget about the outside world. I pulled out a can of beans and heated them up over the fire. The smell of the food mixed with the wood smoke, filling the air with a familiar camping scent. I felt a little more at ease, trying to convince myself that I'd made the right choice coming out here alone. But then, something strange happened. I was sitting by the fire, poking the wood with a stick, when I heard a snap from the forest. It was a branch breaking, the kind of sound you'd hear when something heavy stepped on it. I froze, my hands still gripping the stick. My heart rate sped up. I glanced around, but all I could see were the dark silhouettes of the trees, the shadows stretching long in the fading light. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves, but the sound wasn't right. It was too loud, too deliberate. The fire crackled again, louder this time, and I stood up, my eyes scanning the woods. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and shone it into the woods, but all I could see were more trees, the light bouncing off the dark trunks. Another snap. This time it was closer. I could feel my pulse quicken, my mind racing through all the possible explanations. A deer? A bear? It didn't make sense. This was a relatively quiet part of the forest, and animals generally avoided human campsites. But there was something off about this, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a wild animal, right? That was the most likely explanation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was deliberately making noise, as if trying to get my attention. The fire crackled louder, and I sat back down by it, trying to focus on the warmth. But my mind kept drifting back to the sounds from the woods. I glanced over my shoulder again, shining the flashlight into the darkness. For a brief second, I thought I saw a figure moving among the trees. It was just a shadow, but it was enough to make my heart race. I immediately stood up, the firelight casting strange, flickering shadows on the ground. My flashlight beam darted across the woods, but there was nothing there. I was starting to feel ridiculous, standing there with my flashlight in hand, my eyes darting between the trees. But then the sound came again. It wasn't a branch snapping this time. It was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly through the forest. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, listening intently. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I could hear it clearly now, each step crunching on the underbrush, coming closer and closer. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and leave. But then I realized something. The path back to my car was at least a 10-minute walk, and the sun had already set. If I left now, I'd be walking through the dark, alone in the woods, with whatever was out there following me. I thought about my phone. I fumbled through my pockets and pulled it out. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. It was one of the reasons I came out here, to escape the digital world for a while. I was completely cut off. The footsteps stopped. Everything went silent. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe it was an animal after all. But then I heard a voice, a low, raspy sound, almost like a whisper, coming from just beyond the tree line. It wasn't a language I recognized. It was strange and guttural, like something I'd never heard before. It sent a shiver down my spine. I was frozen. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I had to stay calm. I couldn't afford to panic. I stood there, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand as I slowly turned it toward the trees. Nothing. No movement. No figure. Just the dark, quiet woods. But I could still feel it. Something was out there and it was watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned toward my tent, grabbed my gear, and made a run for it. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was beyond that point. I just needed to get away. My footsteps were loud as I raced through the woods, stumbling over roots and branches in the dark. The flashlight bounced in my hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. But all I could think about was the sounds behind me, the footsteps that seemed to be following me. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, I came to the edge of the forest, where the clearing opened up to the path. I could see my car parked in the distance. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs aching from the exertion. I was almost there. Just as I reached my car, I heard a crash behind me, like something large had fallen. I didn't look back. I slammed the door open, jumped inside, and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, and I drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small gas station with bright lights and a few cars parked outside. I pulled in, took a deep breath, and tried to steady myself. I was still rattled, my mind racing over everything that had happened. I never went back to that campsite. I don't know what it was that night. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was something else. But whatever it was enough to convince me that some parts of the forest are better left unexplored. That night, I learned a valuable lesson. There are things out there in the woods, things that don't want to be found. And sometimes the best thing to do is to listen to your gut and get the hell out of there while you still can. I had been planning this camping trip for months, something to get away from the grind, clear my head, and hopefully find some peace. It was a solo trip, no distractions, no one else around to interfere. I had picked a remote spot near a river, far from any popular campsites, hoping for total solitude. The place was known for its serene beauty, surrounded by dense woods, with just the sound of the water flowing through the rocks and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My backpack was packed and I was ready. The hike to the campsite was more difficult than I had expected. The trail was narrow, winding through trees that looked older than anything I had ever seen. The ground was uneven, and the rocks were slick from the morning dew. My boots made a dull crunch as I walked, breaking the stillness of the forest. There was no one else on the trail, which made the place feel even more isolated. After a few hours, I finally reached the river. The water rushed by, looking cool and clear. There was a small clearing by the riverbank, just big enough for my tent and a small campfire. I set up my tent and gathered firewood from the forest floor. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky turned a mix of pink and orange, and I lit the fire. It crackled and popped, the warmth from the flames washing over me. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive in a different way. The night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush created an eerie feeling, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was just nature. I cooked some simple food over the fire and ate it slowly, savoring the silence. There was no rush, no deadlines, just me and the wilderness. After eating, I leaned back against a tree and watched the fire. The flames danced and flickered, casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. The smell of smoke filled the air, and the crackling sound was oddly soothing. The peacefulness of the moment made me feel at ease, but as the night deepened, something changed. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. A sudden rustling in the bushes behind me made me tense. It wasn't the usual sound of wind or small animals. It sounded deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, and everything became unnervingly quiet. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal, nothing to worry about. But then, the air seemed to grow colder. I hadn't noticed it before, but now the chill in the air was unmistakable. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The fire still burned, but the warmth seemed to retreat just a little further with every passing minute. I decided to check on the fire, adding more wood to keep the flames high. As I moved around the camp, I noticed something strange. There were marks on the ground near the tent. They were small indentations, like something had pressed into the dirt. I knelt down to examine them, but they weren't animal tracks. They were too deep, too circular. My heart skipped a beat. Could it have been a person? Someone else out here? No, I told myself. It was probably just an animal, some other creature walking around in the dark. I had to be imagining things, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy in the back of my mind. I finished tending to the fire and sat down near it again, trying to push the unsettling thoughts away. The night was still too still. Even the river seemed quieter now, its usual gurgling sounds muffled. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to escape the strange sense of unease creeping up on me. The tent was small and snug, and I zipped it up tightly. But even inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to every sound outside. Every crackling twig, every whisper of the wind, made my skin crawl. I must have drifted off to sleep eventually because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start. The fire outside had died down, and the forest was completely silent. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, nothing. The silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, a low, soft sound, like something was moving just outside the tent, slowly, carefully, as if trying not to be noticed. My breath caught in my throat. I held absolutely still, straining to listen. The sound continued, getting closer. It was almost like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I reached for the flashlight beside me, my fingers trembling. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing outside the tent, just shadows. I exhaled slowly, telling myself it was my imagination running wild. The forest was full of life, and sometimes that meant strange sounds. But that nagging feeling didn't go away. I lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, listening. The noises outside stopped for a moment, and just when I thought I might be able to relax, I heard something else. A scraping sound, like something was dragging along the ground near the edge of the tent. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. It was so close now, too close. I grabbed my backpack and fumbled through it until I found my knife, the cold steel reassuring in my hand. There was no reason to think it was a person, I told myself, but the fear was too strong. What if it was? What if someone was out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake? I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for whatever it was to make a move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest went completely still again, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But I couldn't relax. My mind kept racing with thoughts of what could be out there. I wanted to run, to grab my things and leave, but something told me that would only make it worse. I decided to wait it out. The first light of dawn finally started to creep through the trees, and with it, a sense of calm washed over me. The silence of the night was replaced by the sounds of birds waking up and the rustling of leaves in the early morning breeze. I could see clearly now, and the fear that had gripped me the night before began to fade. It had just been a figment of my imagination, I convinced myself. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. The sooner I was away from this spot, the better. As I packed my things, I noticed more marks on the ground, more impressions in the dirt near the edge of the tent. This time, they were even more distinct, like someone had walked around the tent while I slept. My stomach turned. It hadn't been my imagination. I hurriedly finished packing, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. I didn't even bother to break down the tent properly. I just grabbed it, rolled it up, and shoved it into my bag. I had to get out of there. The hike back was faster than the way in, my legs moving almost mechanically, my mind focused entirely on putting distance between myself and the site. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being followed. Every noise in the woods made my heart race. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt like I could breathe again. The parking lot was empty, just as it had been when I left the day before. I threw my backpack into the back of my truck and slammed the door. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire time, that something or someone had been lurking just out of sight. I didn't tell anyone about what happened out there. It felt too strange, too unbelievable. But I'll never forget that sense of being watched, that suffocating silence, and the scraping sounds that seemed to follow me throughout the night. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone in a remote place like that again. Some things are better left unexplored. It was late in the summer when I decided to go camping by myself. I hadn't been in a while, and I thought it would be good for me to clear my head, disconnect from everything, and just get away for a bit. I had everything planned out, or so I thought. I was going to head to a spot I'd visited a few times in the past, a quiet place nestled between the trees by a small, clear lake. It was remote but not too far from civilization. Perfect for some solitude, I thought. The drive was long, but the winding roads through the forests were beautiful, and the sky was clear. I kept thinking how peaceful it was going to be. The GPS didn't take me directly to the spot, but I knew the area well enough to find my way without much trouble. By the time I parked my truck near the campsite, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting the whole area in a warm, golden light. I felt a little rush of excitement as I unloaded my gear. Setting up camp was second nature to me. I had my tent up in less than 20 minutes. The fire pit was ready to go, and I set out some dry wood I'd brought along with me. I wasn't planning on doing anything too fancy for dinner. Just some simple camping food, hot dogs and beans, easy enough. It was just me, the forest, and the evening ahead. As night began to fall, the sounds of the forest started to take over. The crickets, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. It was all so calming. I made my fire and sat down in front of it, the warmth on my face a nice contrast to the cool evening air. I ate my dinner, then just sat there, letting my thoughts drift. After a while, the darkness started to settle in fully, and the temperature dropped. I could hear more movement in the trees now, things scurrying around, maybe a raccoon or a deer. The stars were starting to appear in the sky, and it felt so peaceful that I nearly fell asleep right there by the fire. But then, something changed. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but it was this uneasy feeling, like I wasn't alone anymore. The wind stopped, and everything became strangely quiet. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the woods, miles away from any kind of help, so it's easy to let your imagination get away from you. But then I heard it. A branch snapped somewhere in the woods behind me. It wasn't a big sound, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked over my shoulder, but the darkness was thick, and I couldn't see anything. I figured it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote. They're common in the area. They don't usually bother people, though. I tried to shake it off and focus back on the fire, but the feeling of being watched just wouldn't go away. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and my stomach felt tight, like I was holding my breath without meaning to. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. It wasn't much, just a small one, but it was enough to scan the area around me. I swept the beam of light through the trees, trying to reassure myself that everything was fine. Nothing, no movement, no animals. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and sat back down by the fire, but the unease didn't leave me. I was still alert, still feeling like there was something out there, just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. It was just my mind, it was just the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After a while, I decided to crawl into my tent. It was still early enough that I wasn't tired, but I thought I could at least get some sleep and let the night pass. I zipped myself into the tent and turned on the small lantern I had inside. The light was soft, but it was enough to give me a sense of security. The wind picked up again, and I heard it moving through the trees, a soft whistling sound. It was soothing, but then came another sound that wasn't so comforting. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but there was definitely something outside my tent. A shuffling noise, like someone was walking slowly through the woods, their feet crunching the dry leaves and twigs underfoot. I froze. It wasn't an animal. The pace was too deliberate, too slow. My heart started racing, and I suddenly felt trapped inside the small tent. I wanted to unzip it and go out to see what it was, but I didn't. I stayed still, listening. The sound continued, circling my campsite, but it never got any closer to the tent. I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself that it was just some curious animal, but I couldn't stop the wave of panic rising in my chest. What if it wasn't? What if someone was out there? Eventually, the sound faded, and I tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was probably just a person hiking through the woods, someone who didn't even know there was a campsite here. It was a big forest after all. People hike through it all the time. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I must have dozed off eventually, but my sleep wasn't deep. I kept waking up every so often, checking the time on my phone, listening for any sounds outside. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, that I finally heard it again. The same slow, deliberate shuffling, but this time it was closer, right outside my tent. Couldn't breathe. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to even blink. The sound stopped for a moment, and then I heard a quiet tap against the side of the tent, like something or someone had brushed up against it. My pulse was hammering in my ears. Couldn't move, couldn't think straight. I had to do something, anything. I waited until the sound moved away, then slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The forest was completely still. No one in sight, just the faint glow of the moon casting long shadows over the campsite. I felt like I was going crazy, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. I packed up everything in a rush, too scared to take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved the tent into its bag, as I loaded everything into the back of my truck. I was trying not to panic, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to leave, to drive away and never come back. By the time I was done, the sun was just starting to rise. I was already halfway down the winding road, my truck bouncing over the uneven path. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, focusing on the road ahead, my heart still pounding in my chest. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was nothing, just a product of my overactive imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something in those woods that I wasn't supposed to know about. Either way, I didn't care. The thing that mattered most was that I made it out safely. And as I drove home, I promised myself that the next time I went camping, I'd do it somewhere a lot more populated, where the only things I'd have to worry about were mosquitoes and bad weather. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the dark. It's the way your mind convinces you of things that may or may not be true. But I've never gone camping alone again, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplored. The crackling sound of the campfire was the only thing I could hear as I sat there, staring at the dancing flames. I had been camping alone for the past couple of days, far from civilization, deep into the forest. It wasn't the first time I had gone camping by myself, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the way the forest felt so quiet, unnervingly quiet. No birds singing, no rustling leaves, just the occasional snap of a twig. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had set up camp near a small creek, where the sound of running water was soothing. My tent stood sturdy, tucked under the cover of some large trees. I had a small fire going to keep me warm, even though it wasn't too cold. The warmth of the fire felt good against the slight chill in the air. I roasted a few marshmallows, enjoying the simplicity of it all. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to disconnect from everything. But even as I tried to settle into the calm, something kept gnawing at me. Something felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. My senses felt heightened, more aware of every little sound. The wind, the crackling fire, the occasional rustling of leaves. Everything seemed to be amplified. I tried to shake it off and focus on my surroundings, but I couldn't. I checked the time on my watch. It was getting late, the sky darkening, and I knew I should probably turn in for the night. I snuffed out the fire with some water, careful not to make a mess, then crawled into my tent. The inside was cozy, and I unrolled my sleeping bag, settling in for the night. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I camped in remote places before, and I was used to the sounds of nature. But tonight it was different. The silence, the stillness of the forest. Something felt like it was waiting, watching. The night went on. The wind picked up a little, and I heard the trees creaking and swaying. But beyond that, there was nothing else. No animal noises, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if all the animals had just vanished. I shifted uncomfortably in my sleeping bag, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, I was out here alone, and it was natural to feel a little on edge in the dark, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to get some sleep. I don't know how much time had passed when I heard it. A distant, soft sound, almost like footsteps, but too deliberate, too measured to be an animal. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening closely. The footsteps, or whatever they were, came closer. Slow, steady, and unmistakably human-like. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it be someone else camping nearby? But why would they be out here so late? There were no other campsites within miles, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trail when I'd arrived. The footsteps were too even to be a wild animal, too purposeful to be a deer or a bear. I grabbed my flashlight from the corner of the tent, my hand shaking slightly as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trees around me, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, everything went quiet again. I waited, straining my ears, but the silence was suffocating. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard something else, a soft rustling, like someone was moving through the bushes just beyond the tree line. It wasn't the usual sound of leaves or twigs breaking under the weight of an animal. It was deliberate, controlled. I quickly pulled the zipper of the tent open, just a crack, and peered out. My flashlight beam swept across the area, but I saw nothing. The forest looked still and undisturbed. Yet, my gut told me something wasn't right. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I closed the tent flap and lay back down, trying to ignore the rising panic. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the wind or an animal or even my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The unease in my stomach tightened, and I found it nearly impossible to relax. Hours passed, and eventually, I drifted off to a restless sleep. But my dreams were filled with dark shapes lurking in the shadows, following me through the woods. When I woke up, the first light of dawn was creeping through the trees. The forest was still quiet, and the air had a damp, cold quality to it. I quickly packed up my gear, eager to get moving, to put the strange events behind me. As I gathered my things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, just outside the perimeter of my campsite, were faint footprints in the soft ground. They were too large to be from an animal, and they were too close to my tent. The tracks were fresh, as if whoever made them had been standing just there, watching me while I slept. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The last thing I wanted was to stick around and investigate further. I grabbed my bag, my equipment, and I started hiking back toward the main trail, trying to stay calm, trying not to panic. But every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my mind in a frenzy. The woods were silent again, as if nothing had happened, but the memory of those footsteps haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that was waiting for me to let my guard down. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I never saw anyone, never found any trace of another person. But I know what I felt, I know what I heard, and I know that whatever it was real. I don't go camping alone anymore, not in places that feel as isolated as that. The woods have a way of hiding things you can't always explain. But I'm still here, and I'm safe. That's all that matters now. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to take a break from the usual grind. Work had been stressful, and I felt the need to get away from it all, just for a little while. I had always enjoyed hiking and camping, so I figured I'd take the opportunity to explore a remote camping spot I had heard about. It was off the beaten path, far away from crowds, and promised solitude in the heart of the woods. That's exactly what I needed, a chance to clear my mind and reset. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, some food, and of course a flashlight just in case, and headed out. The trail was rugged, and the deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. The only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call. The trees towered over me, their branches swaying gently in the wind, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was crisp, cool, and smelled of pine and earth. By the time I reached the spot I had planned to camp, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, the kind that made you feel small and insignificant just standing beneath them. There was a stream nearby, its water gurgling over rocks, which was a comforting sound. I got my fire started quickly, grateful for the dry wood I had gathered along the way. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows around me. I could feel the warmth spreading, and for a while, I just sat there, staring into the fire. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. I zipped up my jacket and stoked the fire a little more to keep the chill at bay. I ate some of the food I had brought, nothing fancy, just simple, easy-to-make meals for one. The peace of the forest surrounded me. I felt like I was a world away from everything. The last trace of daylight faded, and I found myself alone in complete darkness, save for the fire. The forest was alive with sounds now. Insects hummed in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves from the trees above kept my senses alert. But something about the night felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was watching me. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had camped alone many times before and had never felt this way. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's rest would clear my mind. The ground was hard, but the sleeping bag was warm enough. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my tent. The wind howled outside, making the trees creak and groan as they swayed. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the sounds of the forest, but my mind kept racing. What if something went wrong? What if I wasn't prepared for something unexpected? It wasn't long before I drifted into an uneasy sleep, the noises from outside blending into the background. But then, something woke me up. A noise, a faint rustling, like something moving through the leaves, close to my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too close. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I lay there, frozen, listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, and then I heard a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I held my breath, straining to hear. The noise came again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural grunt. It was close, too close. I reached for the flashlight at the side of my tent, but my hand trembled as I grabbed it. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a bear or something else? I slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The fire was nothing more than glowing embers now, casting weak light on the surrounding trees. My breath caught in my throat when I saw something move, a shadow darting between the trees. It was quick, too quick for my eyes to focus on. My pulse raced as I scrambled to pull the zipper of the tent back up. The thud came again, louder this time, followed by a few more grunts. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack, shoved my sleeping bag into it, and grabbed the flashlight. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to sit in my tent like a sitting duck. I quickly packed up my things, trying to make as little noise as possible. My hands shook, but I managed to get everything into my bag. The rustling outside grew louder, and I could hear twigs snapping underfoot. The shadow moved again, but this time, it seemed to be getting closer. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I slung the pack over my shoulder and grabbed my knife from my belt. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, and I flinched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The forest was eerily silent for a moment, like everything was holding its breath. I made my way quickly down the path, hoping the creature, whatever it was, hadn't heard me. My flashlight flickered as I moved, and the beam cut through the trees in front of me, revealing nothing but the dense woods. The thuds were still coming from behind me, but I dared not look back. My mind was focused on one thing: getting out of there. The path was rugged and uneven, and I stumbled a few times in my panic. The flashlight beam shook with my hand as I tried to keep my balance. I didn't know how far I had to go to get to safety, but I wasn't stopping until I felt far enough away. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart leap into my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw it, the edge of the forest. The trees thinned out, and I could see the moonlight breaking through the branches. My pace quickened, and I burst through the last line of trees, stumbling into an open field. I collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stayed there for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts and catching my breath. The night was quiet now, and I couldn't hear any more rustling behind me. It seemed like the danger had passed. My heart was still racing, but I felt a little safer now that I was out in the open. I knew I couldn't go back to the campfire, not with whatever had been out there. I decided to make my way to a nearby town, even though it was still a long way off. It was the only option. I managed to make it to the town by morning. My legs ached, and my body was exhausted, but I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I reached the first signs of civilization. I went straight to a small diner, hoping to calm my nerves with some food and coffee. As I sat there, sipping my drink, I reflected on what had happened. I wasn't sure what I had heard that night. Whether it was a wild animal or something else entirely, I would never know for certain. But I had learned a valuable lesson. Nature, in all its beauty, can be unpredictable and dangerous. And sometimes, it's better to trust your instincts and get out when you feel something isn't right. I knew I'd be back in the woods someday, but I would never forget that night. I'd always be more cautious, more aware, and never take my safety for granted again. By the time I left the diner and walked to my car, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever had happened out there, I had survived, and that was enough. It was early fall when I decided to head out for a camping trip. The weather was perfect for hiking, and the leaves were just starting to change colors, giving everything a fiery glow. I'd been working hard recently, and I needed the break. I had everything packed: my tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and the essentials. I didn't plan on going far, just a couple of nights in the woods, far enough from the crowds, but close enough in case something went wrong. The forest was quiet when I arrived, with only the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The campsite was tucked into a small valley, with a creek nearby that provided the comforting sound of running water. I'd been here before a few years ago, and it had always been peaceful, the perfect place to get away from it all. I set up my tent, making sure everything was secured. I spent a little more time than usual checking things, maybe because I had that gut feeling that something was different this time. After everything was set up, I gathered some firewood and started a fire. The warmth from the flames was a comfort, and I felt my muscles unwind as I stared into the orange glow. The sound of the crackling fire mixed with the evening's breeze, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. I cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and pasta, and ate slowly, enjoying the solitude. The air smelled crisp, and the firelight cast long shadows against the trees. It was nice to just be alone for a while. As the night grew darker, the temperature dropped, and the forest grew quieter. The usual nighttime sounds of animals seemed to disappear, replaced by an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I shrugged it off as nerves, maybe from being out here alone. The woods are big, and nature can feel different depending on the time of year. I stoked the fire a little more, trying to push away the uneasy feeling creeping into my mind. I thought I heard something, but it was too faint to be sure. A twig snapping? A rustle in the bushes? I tried to reassure myself that it was just a deer or some other animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I settled into my tent, zipped it up tightly, and laid down on my sleeping bag. The warmth from the fire outside didn't reach me, and the cold started creeping in. As I lay there, trying to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. A faint sound, something scraping against the ground just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening carefully. My heart started to race, but I couldn't pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone or something was trying to move quietly. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, shining through the thin fabric of the tent. Nothing. No shadows moving, no sign of anyone out there. I waited, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? It had to be. I turned off the flashlight and tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easy. Every small noise in the woods seemed amplified now, and the silence felt heavy. Hours passed, and eventually, exhaustion overcame me. I finally drifted off, though it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, unsure if I'd been dreaming or if there were really sounds in the night. The worst part was the sensation that something was out there, watching, waiting. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. At some point, I finally fell into a deeper sleep, but that didn't last long. I was jolted awake by a loud crack, followed by a series of sharp rustling noises outside the tent. My pulse raced as I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight again and shone it at the tent's walls. The rustling stopped as soon as the light hit it. For a moment, everything was still. I got out of the sleeping bag, trying to be as quiet as possible. My hands were trembling as I unzipped the tent. I poked my head out, scanning the area. The fire was just a few glowing embers now, but I could still make out the outline of the trees around me. The night was cold, the air biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I was focused on the shadows. Nothing. There was nothing there. No animals, no figures lurking in the trees, no signs of anything unusual. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch falling. I thought I had been hearing things. That was it, right? Just my imagination. But as I was about to go back into the tent, I noticed something strange. The ground around my campsite, where I had been walking earlier, gathering wood, was disturbed. The soil was dug up in several places, as though something had been rooting around, or worse, digging. I had been so focused on setting up the camp and getting the fire going earlier that I didn't notice it. But now, in the faint light of the dying fire, I could clearly see the disturbed earth. A chill ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. I had been alone here for hours, and nothing had been out of place when I arrived. I thought about the noise I heard earlier. Maybe something had been moving around, or maybe someone else was out here. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been watching me? Had someone been out there in the woods, waiting for me to let my guard down? The thought made my stomach turn. I didn't want to stay out here any longer, but I also knew I couldn't just pack up in the middle of the night. It was too dark, too dangerous. I had to stick it out, but I wasn't sure if I could handle another sleepless night of hearing things in the dark. I decided to keep watch for a while. I pulled the logs closer to the fire and sat next to it, my eyes scanning the darkness. Every little sound, the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, had me on edge. The fire flickered and popped, casting long, exaggerated shadows. Time seemed to drag on, every minute stretching out into what felt like hours. Eventually, the night began to lose its grip on the world around me. The sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping through the trees. I stayed up, watching the camp, trying to stay alert. By the time the sun had fully risen, I felt a little better. The woods were quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that didn't want me to feel safe. After packing up my things, I took one last look around the campsite. Everything seemed normal, and I found myself doubting the fear I'd felt the night before. Maybe it had all been a combination of nerves, the isolation, and my overactive imagination. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about. I hiked out, and the day went on without incident. The woods had returned to their calm, peaceful state, and I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. But I never went back to that spot. Something about that campsite, the disturbed ground, and the sounds in the dark stuck with me. It was the kind of feeling that lingered even after you'd left, a quiet unease that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried to forget. Looking back, I still don't know what it was, whether it was an animal, another camper, or just my mind playing tricks. But I learned something that day. Sometimes, no matter how peaceful a place seems, you can't ignore the sense that something just isn't right. And sometimes, it's better to trust your instincts and get out before you find out what's really lurking in the woods. The dense forest surrounding the small cabin made me uneasy from the start. The trees, tall and ancient, leaned inward as if they were watching me, their branches like crooked fingers reaching out to snatch anything that ventured too far from the beaten path. I had been driving for hours, following a map on my phone that had only vague directions. Finally, The dirt road had given way to the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old place, probably built decades ago, with a sagging roof and weathered wood that creaked in the wind. The kind of cabin that looked like it had been abandoned more times than it had been lived in. Still, it was the only place I could afford for the weekend. I had planned this trip to get away from everything, the noise of the city, the constant pressure at work, the never-ending flow of emails and messages. Just me, the woods, and some peace. The first night wasn't too bad. It was quiet, but the kind of silence that felt almost oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up late, watching the flickering of the fire in the stone hearth, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It wasn't until I decided to go to bed that things started to feel off. I lay in the bed, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The wind was picking up, making the trees sway and groan. My eyes were growing heavy, but there was something about the atmosphere that kept me from fully relaxing. I could hear small noises, like twigs snapping, as if someone or something was walking outside. But every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. The cabin was far from any neighbors, so it could have been animals moving through the woods. I turned over and closed my eyes, but the noises didn't stop. The wind howled louder, and the trees began to shake. I couldn't tell if the sounds were getting closer or if I was just imagining them. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a faint thud, like something heavy dropping onto the ground, followed by slow footsteps crunching in the gravel outside. This wasn't normal. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. My mind tried to reason with me. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a deer or something else wandering close to the cabin. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight I had placed on the bedside table and quietly slipped out of bed. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the worn floorboards beneath my feet as I tiptoed towards the window. I didn't want to make any noise, but my nerves were on edge. I peeked through the thin curtains, trying to spot whatever had caused the noise. The beam of my flashlight swept across the yard, but I didn't see anything at first. For a second, I almost convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, as the light moved further to the right, I froze. A figure, standing near the tree line. It was hard to make out details, but I could see the shape of a person or something like it. They stood completely still, staring in my direction. I quickly pulled away from the window, my heart pounding. Was someone out there? I felt a cold sweat running down my back as I backed away from the window and returned to the bed, clutching the flashlight in my hands. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The night dragged on, every creak and groan of the cabin making me jump. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what could be out there. But morning finally came, and with it, a fleeting sense of relief. I decided to get up, make a cup of coffee, and head out to explore the surrounding area. Maybe the woods weren't as spooky as I'd made them out to be the night before. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin looked less threatening in the daylight, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground for any signs of someone else's presence. There were no footprints in the dirt, nothing that would suggest anyone had been out there. I let out a breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe the figure I had seen last night was just a trick of the shadows. I tried to push the feeling aside as I explored further into the woods, trying to get a feel for the land. The trees were thick here, their trunks dark and twisted, like they'd been growing for centuries. The ground was uneven, and the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice something strange. The birds had stopped singing. There was no chirping, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. A cold chill ran down my spine as I paused, my eyes scanning the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me again. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned, half expecting to see that figure from last night standing behind me. But there was nothing. I continued walking, my steps quickening as I tried to shake the growing unease. The silence was unbearable, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I eventually found a small clearing, where the sunlight broke through the canopy above, creating a patch of warmth on the forest floor. I stopped, deciding to take a break and catch my breath. That's when I heard it. Faint, distant sound, almost like a whisper. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, almost as if someone was calling out to me. My heart started to race as I stood still, listening. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to turn back, but I couldn't ignore the curiosity, the need to know what it was. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, walking deeper into the forest. The further I went, the darker it became. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the light. The air grew colder, and the silence was deafening. The only sound now was my own breathing and the crunch of the forest floor under my feet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a small, abandoned shed. It was old, even more decrepit than the cabin, with its door hanging off its hinges and the roof caving in. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached, the whispering sound growing louder. I took a step inside, my flashlight illuminating the dusty, forgotten space. There was nothing inside except old, rusted tools and broken furniture. But then, on the far wall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A series of marks scratched into the wood. They were too uniform, too deliberate, like someone had been carving them into the wall for a long time. I couldn't make out what they meant, but they didn't look like anything natural. They were just wrong. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about this place felt off, like I had crossed into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something on the ground. A small, tattered piece of cloth. It was dark red, almost like it had been stained. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The fabric was old, frayed at the edges, but it didn't look like it had been there long. Suddenly, a loud noise from behind me made me spin around. It was a crash, followed by the sound of something heavy falling. My heart leapt in my chest as I backed out of the shed, looking around wildly. I didn't know what was happening, but I had a strong feeling that I needed to get out of there. I turned and ran, pushing my way through the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing darker and thicker the further I went. By the time I reached the cabin, I was nearly out of breath. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. The whispering was gone, but something felt wrong, like I was being hunted. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, too scared to go back into the woods. I kept the lights on and stayed close to the fire, trying to calm myself down. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The sounds from outside grew louder, more persistent. The wind howled through the trees, and I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel. I didn't dare look outside again. I just stayed where I was, waiting for whatever was out there to go away. By morning, the noise had stopped. The woods were quiet again. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and left the cabin behind. As I drove away, the cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, fading into the trees. I never went back. Sometimes I still think about that place, about the strange noises, the marks on the wall, and the whispers in the woods. But I don't tell anyone about it. I don't think they would understand. All I know is that I wasn't supposed to be there, and I'm glad I left when I did. The night had already fallen when I arrived at the cabin. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from the noise and chaos of the world. I'd rented it through an online listing, a small, remote place deep in the woods, far from the closest town. It seemed perfect, isolated, serene, and quiet. What I didn't know at the time was that the solitude would become a source of dread, a feeling that would settle into the pit of my stomach and never leave. The cabin itself wasn't much. It looked like something straight out of a rustic postcard. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, with ivy creeping up along one side. The small porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. The air smelled fresh and earthy, but there was something more to it, a dampness that lingered in the trees and the ground beneath my feet. I had already been driving for hours, and the long journey had left me feeling drained. All I wanted was to settle in, put my bag down, and forget the outside world for a while. I fumbled for the key the host had left for me under a rock by the door. Once I had it in hand, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit by the setting sun, which cast an orange glow through the windows. It had a cozy feel to it, with an old stone fireplace in the living room, wooden furniture scattered around, and a few rugs on the floor. The walls were adorned with wildlife paintings, and a large bookshelf in the corner contained books on nature, history, and survival. Nothing fancy, just the kind of place that made you feel like you'd step back in time. I dumped my bags by the small table and started unpacking. The quiet was overwhelming. Not the kind of peaceful quiet that brings calm, but a heavy, thick kind of silence that seemed to swallow any noise I made. I sat by the fireplace, lit a small fire, and began to settle in. The night had fully fallen now, and I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned under the pressure. It was the kind of night where every noise felt amplified. As I sat there, a creeping feeling began to set in. It was like something was watching me, waiting just outside the cabin, hidden by the trees. The longer I sat there, the more it grew, and soon it became impossible to ignore. I tried to shake it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. A few hours alone in a cabin and my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't help but glance out of the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing just out of sight. I pushed the thoughts away and decided to go to bed early. The bed was just as simple as everything else in the cabin, old, with a worn wooden frame and a thick quilt that smelled faintly of cedarwood. I lay down, pulling the covers over me, but sleep didn't come easily. The air felt heavy, and the silence was so deep it pressed in on me. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. But eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, the stillness of the cabin pressing in on me. Something was different. There was a sound now, faint but unmistakable, scratching. It was coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound was rhythmic, persistent, and unlike anything I had ever heard before. I listened for a moment, trying to place it, but the noise only seemed to get louder, closer. My heart started to race. I pushed myself up in bed, looking around the room. The small cabin felt smaller now, the walls too close. The sound grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the ground, but from above on the roof. I sat there, frozen, listening to the scratching, which turned into something more like scraping, as though something or someone was dragging itself across the roof. The noise was slow and deliberate, and my pulse quickened. I considered getting up and looking outside, but the thought terrified me. What if it was something I didn't want to see? What if there was someone up there? I stayed in bed, my mind racing, unable to even process the possibility. The sound continued for what felt like hours, the scraping growing more insistent, until it finally stopped. I lay there, wide awake, listening for any movement, but the silence returned. Complete, eerie silence. I couldn't fall back asleep, my mind spinning with thoughts of what had just happened. Was it an animal, or was it something else? The next morning, I woke up with the first light of dawn filtering through the windows. The events of the night before seemed almost impossible in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the unease that still lingered in the pit of my stomach. I decided to go outside, to clear my mind and distract myself. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. The sun was shining brightly now, and the air was crisp, but there was still that lingering sense that something wasn't right. I stepped outside, the cool morning air filling my lungs. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and the trees surrounding the cabin were dense, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was the kind of place you'd expect to hear birds singing, but there was nothing, not a single bird. The silence was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but feel that I was being watched. I glanced up at the roof, half expecting to see some sign of what had caused the strange noises the night before. But there was nothing, just the roof weathered and worn by years of exposure. I decided to take a walk in the woods, hoping that the fresh air and a change of scenery would help calm my nerves. The trees here were massive, ancient things that towered over me, their trunks thick and gnarled. The path wound through the forest, and I followed it deeper and deeper into the woods, hoping that being further from the cabin would somehow ease the tension I felt. But the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't explain. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees, scratches that were too deep to be from animals. They were irregular, jagged lines that ran up the bark, as if something had clawed its way up the trunks. I stopped and examined one of them more closely, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. These marks didn't look like they belonged to any animal I knew. They were too deliberate, too human. I quickly turned around and began making my way back to the cabin. The walk back felt different now, as if I was being followed. The rustling of leaves behind me seemed to grow louder, more pronounced. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of sight. But every time there was nothing, just trees. When I got back to the cabin, I felt a strange sense of relief, but the unease lingered, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here, that something was watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something about this place didn't feel right. That night, I locked the doors and windows and tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of my own breath the only thing I could hear. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. The scratching, this time even louder than before, coming from the roof. My heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly got out of bed, making my way to the window. I shone the light out into the darkness, but there was nothing. The roof was empty. The forest was still. The scratching stopped, but it wasn't over. As I stood there, staring out into the night, I realized something. The quiet was back, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like the world had been smothered by something heavy and dark. I could feel it in my bones, a sense of impending danger that was too real to ignore. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep, exhausted from the constant tension. When I woke up the next morning, I didn't feel any better. The fear still clung to me, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things quickly, not caring to tidy up or double-check anything. I just wanted to leave. As I stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft light over the trees. The cabin stood there, quiet and still. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, nothing more. But it was enough. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my bag and hurried to my car, not looking back. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The woods, the cabin, the strange noises, they were all behind me now. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I didn't need to. I had escaped, and that was all that mattered. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I'd ever imagined. I'd made it out, but there was no doubt in my mind that I would never return to that cabin again. Some places are best left untouched, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was one of those weekends when I needed to get away from the constant buzz of the city. The noise, the traffic, the endless rush. It was all getting to be too much. So I decided to book a cabin in the woods, far from any distractions. I'd rented a small, rustic cabin up in the mountains, hoping for some peace and quiet. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. I had no plans except to unwind and clear my mind. The drive there was beautiful, though a little unnerving. The road narrowed as I made my way up into the hills, the trees pressing closer together, their shadows stretching across the path. The GPS signal dropped as I got farther from town, but I didn't mind. I was used to the feeling of being off the grid. It was part of the appeal. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't what I found. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, its wooden exterior weathered by time, but it had a charm to it. The windows were large, letting in the natural light, and the chimney was puffing out a thin stream of smoke. The whole place felt isolated, like it was the only building for miles around. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and walked up the front steps, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The door opened easily, and inside was just as rustic as the outside. The floors were hardwood, the furniture simple but sturdy, and there was a fireplace that looked ready for a fire. There was no TV, no internet, no cell signal, nothing to distract me. I smiled, feeling a sense of relief settle in my chest. It was exactly what I needed. The first night was peaceful. I made myself a small dinner, just some pasta, and then spent the evening reading a book by the fire. The crackling of the wood and the occasional rustle of leaves outside were the only sounds. I had a sense of calm, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I went to bed early, pulling the thick blankets over myself and falling asleep to the sound of the wind howling outside. But the next day, things started to feel off. I woke up early, around sunrise, and opened the cabin's front door to take in the view. The forest stretched out before me, the morning fog still hanging in the trees. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no signs of animals. The kind of silence that made you feel like something wasn't right, like the world had held its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just because I wasn't used to being so isolated. I made myself some breakfast, then decided to go for a walk. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their trunks thick and twisted. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice small things that made my skin crawl. There were broken branches on the ground, like something or someone had been pushing through the woods. The air felt heavier here, thick with moisture, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I kept walking, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe some animals had been through. But then I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Up ahead, I noticed a trail of footprints, fresh and deep, leading off the path and into the brush. They were large, much too big to be from any animal I knew of around here. My heart began to race, and I found myself hesitating. Could have been from someone hiking through, right? I shook my head, trying to push the fear away, but the unease was growing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and decided to follow the tracks. It was stupid, I knew that, but curiosity got the best of me. I followed the footprints for what felt like hours, weaving through the trees until they led me to a small clearing. The moment I stepped into the clearing, I felt it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off about the place, like it had been disturbed. The ground was torn up and there were more tracks, more than I could count, leading in all directions. They seemed to be everywhere, crisscrossing and overlapping. The air was thick, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I looked around, my eyes scanning the area, but there was nothing, just trees and the eerie silence. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw it. A large, jagged stone protruding from the ground, its surface covered in what looked like old, dried blood. My stomach churned, and I stepped back, feeling my pulse quicken. It was too much. I had to get back to the cabin. I ran back, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I got from the clearing, the more the weight lifted from my shoulders, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the sky had turned a deep, unsettling shade of purple. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had been overreacting. It was just some strange thing in the woods, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the wind picked up, The howling outside was louder than before, and the cabin creaked and groaned in protest. I tried to sleep, but every little sound made me jump. It felt like the forest was alive, like it was watching me. I pulled the blankets tighter around me and shut my eyes, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I drifted off, only to be woken by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the house. My heart skipped a beat. Was it just the wind, or was someone out there? I held my breath, listening, but the steps didn't stop. They circled the cabin, coming closer and closer until I could hear them right outside the window. The sound of heavy breathing followed, and I felt my stomach drop. Couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then a loud thud hit the side of the cabin. The entire house shook. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and ran to the front door. I wasn't going to sit here and wait for whatever or whoever was out there. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I considered leaving, but the thought of walking back into that forest was too much. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle, and waited by the door. Minutes passed, maybe hours, but the footsteps eventually stopped. I slowly opened the door, holding the knife in front of me. The night was still and quiet. No sign of anyone or anything. I stepped outside, my breath coming in short bursts, but there was nothing. The trees loomed above me, their branches swaying in the wind, but the clearing was empty. I didn't know how long I stood there, just staring into the dark, but eventually, I decided to go back inside. It wasn't safe out here. I locked the door behind me, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. I couldn't stay here any longer, I knew that, but I didn't want to leave. Something about this place felt like it was calling me, pulling me in. It was a strange feeling, one I couldn't explain. The next morning, I packed up everything. I didn't care about the peace and quiet anymore. I just wanted to leave. I grabbed my things and left the cabin, driving back down the winding road. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the cabin, standing silent and still in the distance. It looked so harmless, so ordinary, but I knew better now. I drove for hours trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But even as I drove further from the woods, I couldn't escape it. The unease lingered, and I couldn't help but wonder what had really been out there, in those woods, and whether I'd ever truly be able to leave it behind. It was late autumn when I decided to go on a solo trip to a cabin tucked away in the dense woods, miles away from any sort of civilization. The plan was simple: to get away from the noise of life and enjoy some quiet time in nature. I'd rented a small, isolated cabin from an old man I met online. He told me that it was the perfect retreat for someone looking to get away from everything, and after months of working nonstop, I was eager for that escape. The drive to the cabin was long. The roads, mostly dirt and gravel, wound their way through dense forests. Every turn felt like a deeper dive into the wilderness, as if the world outside was slowly being left behind. I couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that hung in the air. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. The closer I got, the more the trees seemed to press in around me, casting long shadows on the road. But I wasn't scared. I figured it was just the isolation, the wilderness, and the unfamiliar surroundings that made everything feel so strange. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a slanted roof that looked like it had been there for decades. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair, and the cabin itself sat at the edge of a large clearing. The view was breathtaking, with the forest stretching out into the distance, the trees starting to lose their leaves in preparation for winter. I took a deep breath, filled with the smell of pine and earth, and felt a small sense of relief. This was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my things quickly, bringing only the essentials, some clothes, a couple of books, and food for the next few days. The cabin had a small kitchen, a single bedroom with a bed that looked old but comfortable, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. Everything was simple, basic, and rustic, just what I wanted. As the sun began to set, I started a fire in the stove and made myself some dinner. The warmth from the fire was comforting, and I could hear the crackling of the wood as I ate in silence. The only light in the cabin came from the flickering flames, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I didn't think much of it. After dinner, I cleaned up and went to bed early, eager to start the next day with a hike. The first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, wrapped in the quiet of the woods. But when I woke up the next morning, I felt something odd in the air. It was hard to describe, a kind of tension, like the calm before a storm. But the sky was clear, and the sun was rising steadily, so I pushed the feeling aside. I spent the morning exploring the woods around the cabin, just walking through the trees, enjoying the solitude. The silence was absolute, and the stillness was almost too much at times. That afternoon, I decided to go on a hike up the nearby hill that overlooked the valley. The trail wasn't marked, but it looked like others had used it in the past. It was a tough climb, with uneven ground and thick underbrush, but I was determined. The further I went, the quieter everything seemed to get. At one point, I stopped to take a breath and realized I couldn't hear any animals. No rustling in the leaves, no birds chirping, just the wind whispering through the branches. It was unnerving, but again, I brushed it off. When I reached the top, the view was stunning. I could see for miles the dense forest, the hills rolling off into the distance, and the cabin far below, a tiny speck in the wilderness. I sat down on a large rock to rest, taking in the scene. But then something caught my eye. Down below, near the cabin, I saw a figure moving. It was hard to make out from this distance, but it looked like a person walking around the cabin, seemingly checking the place out. I stood up, squinting to get a better look, but the figure disappeared behind the cabin. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I hadn't seen anyone when I arrived, and I was certain there were no neighbors around. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, and I hadn't heard any cars or signs of anyone else in the area. My first thought was that maybe someone else had rented the cabin too, or perhaps the old man had someone come out to check on it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way back down the hill, but I didn't go straight to the cabin. I decided to circle around the back and approach cautiously, just in case. As I came around the side of the cabin, I froze. There was no sign of anyone, but the back door, which I had left locked when I went out, was now slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I had clearly locked it before I left. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wasn't armed, and I didn't want to confront whoever it was if they were still inside. I quietly approached the door and peeked inside. The place looked exactly the same as when I left and nothing had been disturbed. But that didn't ease the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my chest. I closed the door and locked it again, but now I was on edge. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't feel comfortable staying either. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping the curtains closed and the door locked. The night was just as unsettling. I sat by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, but the thought of someone being out there, possibly watching me, wouldn't leave my mind. The wind howled outside, and the darkness seemed to press in closer as the hours passed. At some point, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch, but when I went to check, no one was there. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't care about my plans to enjoy the solitude anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed quickly, throwing my things into the car without bothering to organize them. But as I was about to start the engine, I heard something. It was a voice, faint but clear. It sounded like someone calling out from the woods. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. My first thought was to get out of there as fast as I could, but something in the back of my mind told me to listen. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and cautiously stepped out of the car, scanning the trees around me. The woods were still, too still. The air felt thick, heavy. I couldn't see anything, but the voice continued, muffled, distant. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct was to run, but I didn't want to leave without understanding what was happening. I walked toward the edge of the woods, keeping my eyes peeled for any movement. The further I went, the more the voice seemed to fade. I reached a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, lying on the ground, was an old, weathered backpack. It looked like it had been there for a long time, the straps frayed, the fabric torn. I bent down, feeling an uneasy chill run through me. I opened it up, half expecting to find something sinister. But all I found was a pile of old, empty cans and a tattered journal. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was filled with strange, rambling notes about someone who had been lost in these very woods. The handwriting was messy, erratic, like someone in a panic. The last entry was particularly unsettling. "They're watching. Don't trust the cabin." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I closed the journal and threw the backpack aside. The voice, the figure near the cabin, the journal, it all made sense now. Someone had been out here before, someone who had felt the same unease I had. I didn't know if they had left willingly or if something had happened to them, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned and ran back to the car, jumped inside, and slammed the door shut. I drove out of there without looking back, my mind racing with thoughts of what had really happened at that cabin. I didn't know if it was the old man who had told me about the place, or if something else was going on, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The drive back to civilization felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but the memory of the cabin, the journal, and the voice stayed with me. I wasn't sure what I had stumbled upon in those woods, but whatever it wasn't a place I wanted to return to. The cabin sat quietly in the woods, far from the nearest town. I had heard about it from a friend who said it was the perfect place for a weekend getaway, offering solitude and peace. It seemed like the kind of place I needed to clear my head. The last few months had been hectic with work and personal struggles, and I needed a break from everything. No cell service, no internet, just me and nature. I didn't expect things to turn out the way they did. I had rented the cabin for 3 days. It was simple, built out of old, weathered logs with a large front porch that overlooked the forest. The place had an eerie charm about it, but nothing that screamed danger or anything out of the ordinary. It was just a cabin, surrounded by trees. The woods stretched far into the horizon, and all I could hear was the soft rustling of the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird. The inside of the cabin was cozy, though old. There was a large stone fireplace on one wall, a couple of mismatched chairs around it, and a wooden table near the window that looked out over the forest. The kitchen was small, with basic appliances, and the floors creaked with every step. It was exactly what I was looking for, a place to get away from everything and just be alone for a while. I unloaded my bags, settled in, and lit a fire in the hearth. As the flames flickered and danced, I sat back in one of the chairs, relaxing for the first time in what felt like ages. I could feel the tension in my shoulders easing away. For the first evening, everything was peaceful. The sun set behind the trees, casting a golden glow across the sky, and the night settled in quietly. But as the hours passed and the night deepened, I began to notice things. Small things at first. A faint creaking sound, like the cabin was shifting. The wind picking up, causing the trees to sway and groan in a way that made the silence of the cabin seem unsettling. I tried to push it all aside as nothing more than my imagination working overtime. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and there was nothing to fear, right? I went to bed later that night, pulling the thick blankets up around me. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, the fire was still going strong. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but the sounds of the night outside kept me awake. I heard twigs snapping, branches scraping against the windows. The noises seemed to be coming from all around me, and no matter how I tried to ignore them, they only grew louder. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. A thud, a heavy thud, like something large had hit the side of the cabin. I froze, staring into the darkness of the room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The wind? An animal? I didn't know, but the thought of going outside to check wasn't appealing. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the night. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows across the room. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but the sounds outside kept me from finding any rest. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. I had barely slept a wink, and my nerves were on edge. The cabin was still and quiet, the sunlight streaming in through the windows and casting a warm glow on everything. I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before and decided to go for a hike in the woods to clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my lungs. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me as I began my hike. I followed a narrow trail that wound its way deeper into the woods. The sounds of the forest were all around me, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. It was peaceful, but something still felt off. The farther I walked, the more I noticed that the trail seemed to be getting less maintained. The brush was thicker, and the path was harder to follow. It was as if no one had walked this way in years. I pushed forward, determined to get out and enjoy the wilderness, but the unease I felt only grew stronger. As I ventured deeper, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated shed. It was tucked away in a small clearing, hidden behind overgrown shrubs. The wood was rotting, and the roof had collapsed in several places. I approached it cautiously, but something about it gave me a strange feeling. It wasn't just abandoned. It looked like it had been forgotten, left to decay. I peered inside through a crack in the wood. The interior was dark, and I couldn't see much, but there was something in there. A shape, perhaps, a pile of old and used furniture or equipment, but it was hard to tell from where I stood. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed open the door. The hinges creaked loudly, and the door almost fell off its frame. Inside, there was nothing but dust and decay. Cobwebs filled the corners, and the floor was covered in old leaves and dirt. But as I stepped further inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, was something strange. A symbol drawn crudely, as if by someone desperate. It looked like a circle with lines cutting through it, almost like a twisted version of a sun. I couldn't make sense of it, but the sight of it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I backed out of the shed quickly, the door slamming shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. What was that? What had happened here? I didn't know, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned around and started walking back toward the cabin, faster now, not wanting to be out in the woods any longer than I had to be. When I reached the cabin, I tried to push the feeling of unease out of my mind. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the best of me. But something about that symbol kept gnawing at me, making me feel like there was something more to this place than I had realized. The rest of the day passed quietly, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, the woods felt too still, too quiet. I didn't hear the birds or the wind anymore, just the oppressive silence. And that's when I realized I hadn't heard the sound of animals in the woods all day. No rustling leaves, no animal calls, just silence. That night, I decided to keep the fire going all night. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. I sat by the hearth, watching the flames flicker, trying to keep myself calm. The wind outside picked up again, howling through the trees. The noise was deafening, but I stayed inside, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, just as I started to feel a little more at ease, I heard it again. A thud, a loud, unmistakable thud from outside the cabin. My heart stopped. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to know what it was, but the curiosity was too strong. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. The night air was cold, biting at my skin. I scanned the woods, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. The trees were still, and the wind had died down. I was about to turn back inside when I noticed something. On the ground, near the edge of the porch, was a set of tracks. Fresh tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were human footprints. Large, heavy steps that led away from the cabin and into the forest. My heart raced as I realized someone had been out there, watching me. I didn't know who or why, but I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. The peaceful getaway I had hoped for had turned into something far worse. I packed up my things that night. The sound of the wind howling outside made me hurry even more. I didn't stop to check anything. I just grabbed my stuff, threw it into the car, and drove away as fast as I could. As I left, I took one last look at the cabin in my rearview mirror. The lights in the cabin were still on, casting an eerie glow against the darkness of the woods. But no one was there. I never went back, and to this day I don't know who or what was out there. But I knew one thing for sure: some places are better left alone. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin, the first rays of the morning light creeping through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The place was quiet, serene even, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. I had been out here for 2 days already, completely alone, and the isolation was beginning to feel heavier than I anticipated. I had chosen this cabin for its seclusion, wanting to escape the noise of the world for a little while, to have some peace and quiet. But now, as I stretched and got out of bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin itself was small, just a single room with a wood-burning stove, a bed, a table, and a couple of chairs. It was simple, functional, and had a rustic charm to it. The walls were lined with logs that had been carefully stacked to form the structure, and the floor creaked every time you moved. The scent of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air, mixed with the faint odor of damp earth. There was a fireplace in the corner with a stack of firewood nearby, but I hadn't used it much yet. I preferred the stove, which kept the cabin warm enough during the night. I made my way to the small kitchenette, grabbing a mug and filling it with water from the old-fashioned pump sink. It had a metallic taste, but it was cold and refreshing, which was all that mattered. The cabin didn't have much in the way of modern amenities, but that was part of its charm. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no distractions. It was just me, the woods, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The first day had been fine. I had spent most of it exploring the surrounding area, hiking along the narrow trails that wound through the dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The ground was soft, covered in layers of pine needles, and the air smelled fresh and clean. I saw a few deer and squirrels along the way, but mostly it was just the quiet of nature. But by the second day, things started to change. The weather shifted, becoming overcast and gray. The air grew colder, and a mist began to roll in from the mountains, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I found myself becoming more and more uneasy, like there was something lurking just out of sight. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. On the third day, I decided to stay inside. The fog was thick, and I wasn't in the mood to venture out into it. I spent the morning reading a book by the window, watching as the mist crept through the trees, swirling like a living thing. By the afternoon, I had finished the book and was looking for something else to do. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were faint at first, barely visible in the mud near the cabin's entrance. But as I looked closer, I realized they were animal tracks, probably from a large predator, something like a bear or a wolf. I froze, my heart starting to race. It wasn't the tracks themselves that frightened me. It was the fact that they were so close, too close. I hadn't heard anything the night before, no growls or scratching at the door. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I grabbed my backpack and headed to the woodshed outside, hoping to find something to keep my mind occupied. The shed was just a small, dilapidated structure behind the cabin, filled with old tools and random supplies. I had no intention of staying out there long, but I needed something to do. As I reached for a rusty axe, I heard a sound, a faint scraping like metal on stone. It came from the direction of the trees, and I immediately tensed up. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other small creature, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like something was moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see anything through the thick fog, but I could hear it clearly, just beyond the tree-line. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The air felt thick with tension, and I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to run back to the cabin. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, staring at the line where the trees met the fog, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe something else, something I couldn't identify. The sound kept coming, each scrape echoing louder than the last. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I slowly turned and walked back toward the cabin, my footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet. As I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder, but the woods were empty. Inside the cabin, I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt. I couldn't explain it, but I felt safer with it locked. I spent the rest of the day sitting by the window, watching the fog roll in and out of the trees. The tracks outside had vanished, as if whatever had made them had turned back into the forest. But the feeling of being watched remained. The night was the worst. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a freight train. The cabin creaked and groaned, and every time the wind slammed against the walls, I jumped. I tried to distract myself by cooking some food, but my mind kept drifting back to the sounds I had heard earlier. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the air, made me jump. I kept my flashlight close, even though I didn't need it. There was no power, and the only light came from the stove and a few candles scattered around the room. I had never felt so alone. Around midnight, I heard something again, a soft scraping sound. It was distant at first, like it was coming from the edge of the property. But then it grew louder, closer. I stood up, heart racing, and crept to the window. I didn't see anything at first, just the fog swirling around the trees. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow, low to the ground, moving slowly through the mist. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out exactly what it was, but the shape was unmistakable. It was too large to be a raccoon or a deer. It was something much bigger, moving with purpose, like it was searching for something. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear? A wild animal? Or something else entirely? I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave either. Not in the middle of the night, not with the fog and the woods so thick. I grabbed the axe from the corner and held it tightly, my knuckles white. The scraping sound continued, now followed by the distinct sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. Whatever it was circling me. I spent the next several hours on high alert, my eyes darting to every creak and groan the cabin made. The sounds outside stopped eventually, and the night settled into a strange, tense quiet. I stayed up for as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, the fog had lifted. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the world seemed completely normal again. But I knew something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a safe retreat, it felt like a trap. I had no idea what had been out there, or why it had been watching me, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, grabbing only the essentials. I didn't bother to make breakfast or even clean up. I just needed to leave. As I stepped outside, I took one last look at the cabin, the trees, the mist that had now dissipated. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never coming back. I made my way down the path, my heart still racing, but as I walked further from the cabin, I started to feel a little better. The feeling of being watched faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the woods. I didn't know what had been out there, but I was glad it was gone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. I had been working long hours in the office, and I needed a break. So when I found this small, remote cabin in the woods, I jumped at the chance. The listing promised peace, quiet, and a nice retreat from the hustle and bustle of daily life. The cabin was located a couple of hours out of town, tucked deep in a forest. the kind of place where you could disconnect from everything and just breathe. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the unnerving type. There was no chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. The air felt thick, and the sky was overcast, with clouds hanging low, casting a grayish pallor over everything. I shrugged it off as typical mountain weather and unloaded my bags from the car. The cabin itself was charming enough. Wooden, with a wraparound porch and large windows that let in a lot of natural light. Inside, it was cozy, with a fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. The furniture was rustic but comfortable, and there was a faint smell of pine and wood smoke in the air. It had all the hallmarks of a cabin that had been well kept but rarely used. The owner had left a note with the key, thanking me for booking the cabin and wishing me a peaceful stay. Nothing too unusual, just a simple greeting. I spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in. I opened a bottle of wine, sat by the fire, and tried to unwind. The lack of noise was strange at first, but I figured I'd get used to it. It wasn't until the evening came that things started to feel off. As the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin grew colder. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it didn't seem to be enough to chase the chill out of the air. I bundled up in a blanket and decided to head outside for a bit. The porch was dimly lit, but the woods around the cabin were pitch black. I could barely make out the outlines of trees against the dark sky. There was no moon that night, and the clouds swallowed up any hint of stars. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, listening to the quiet. Then I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A faint rustling, like something or someone was moving through the woods. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. The noise was distant, but it seemed to be getting closer. My heart rate picked up, but I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. The fire was dying down, so I added more wood and stoked it to life again. I sat back down, opened the wine, and tried to focus on the book I had brought with me. But the quiet was starting to feel oppressive. The more I sat there, the more I became aware of every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind outside, every flicker of the firelight. It was as if the house was watching me, waiting for something. I tried to ignore the feeling and eventually drifted off to sleep on the couch. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented. The cabin was pitch black, and the fire had gone out. A chill ran down my spine as I sat up, trying to figure out what had woken me. The rustling sound from earlier, was it back? Couldn't be sure. My mind was foggy, and the darkness made everything feel distant and distorted. I glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. That's when I heard it again. This time it was closer, much closer. The noise was unmistakable, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My heart began to race. I knew I shouldn't go outside. Everything inside me screamed to stay put, to lock the door and wait until morning. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I didn't want to feel like I was overreacting. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was the wind again. But the sound, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way to the front door. I didn't want to make any noise, but I couldn't stop myself from listening closely as I approached the window. My hand shook as I peeked through the blinds, shining the flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more paranoid. But just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something, movement in the trees. Something darker than the night around it, just at the edge of the light. I froze. I could see the outline of a figure, tall, maybe 6 feet or more, but hunched, as if crouching low to the ground. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there. My mind raced. Should I call the police? No service. I had no cell signal out here. I could try to drive into town, but it would take over an hour to get to the nearest phone. And if someone was out there, someone who had been watching the cabin, maybe even following me, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to give them a chance to see me leave. I backed away from the window and locked the door. My pulse was hammering in my ears, but I tried to stay calm. I grabbed the fireplace poker, something heavy that could serve as a weapon if it came to that. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I paced the cabin, checking every window, making sure everything was locked. My nerves were shot, and every sound outside made me jump. I couldn't even tell if the footsteps had stopped. I had to stay alert, but the more I waited, the more the sense of dread built up. What was I supposed to do? I felt trapped. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I don't know if it was minutes or hours later, but the world outside seemed to settle. The rustling, the crunching, it just stopped. The morning came slowly. I barely slept, but when the first light filtered through the trees, I took a deep breath and went outside. The air was still cold, but at least the sun was up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though. Every noise, every movement of the trees made me tense up. I grabbed my things, packed my car, and left the cabin as quickly as I could. I didn't care about my plans anymore. I just wanted to get out. When I got home, I checked in with the cabin's owner. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I told them about the strange sounds and the figure I had seen. They were quiet for a moment before replying, saying that it was probably just an animal. The woods were full of them, they said. Nothing to worry about, but there was something about their tone that set off alarms in my head. They didn't seem concerned, not like I expected. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know if what I saw that night was a person or just my imagination running wild, but I'll never be sure. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself I had overreacted, but the unease never really left me. The woods, the silence, the figure, I can't forget it. I can't help but wonder who or what was out there, and why they were watching me. But whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The first time I went to that cabin, I had no idea what I was getting into. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the constant buzz of city life, a place to disconnect, recharge, and maybe get some peace of mind. I had seen the cabin advertised online, nestled in the woods, far from any town or busy roads. Perfect for someone like me who needed to get away from everything. I didn't think twice when I booked the cabin for a weekend. It seemed like the ideal escape. I arrived on a Friday evening, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. The road leading up to the cabin was gravel, the kind that crunched under the tires, winding and narrow. The forest surrounding the path was dense, with trees so tall their tops were lost in the evening mist. It was peaceful, eerily so. No traffic sounds, no people. Just the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. The cabin itself was simple but charming. It was a wooden structure with a small porch that looked out over a clearing. The kind of place you might imagine a rustic retreat to be, with a small fireplace inside and a few mismatched chairs scattered around the living room. The front door creaked as I opened it, the hinges groaning, and the smell of old wood filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, just aged, like the cabin had been standing there for decades, untouched and alone. I set my bags down inside, noting how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the world outside the cabin is miles away. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards as I walked around. The place had a certain charm to it, but there was something in the air too, something unspoken. It wasn't unsettling, but it made me feel as though I wasn't entirely alone. I unpacked and set up a fire in the fireplace. The crackling flames warmed the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The only light came from the fire and a few flickering candles I found in the kitchen. After a while, I made myself some dinner, nothing fancy, just a quick meal I had packed. The kind of meal you eat when you're too tired to cook something more elaborate. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was silly, I thought. There was no reason to be on edge. I was in the middle of nowhere, far away from anything that could cause trouble. But the feeling lingered, growing stronger as the night wore on. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, and the cabin seemed to groan in response. It wasn't the kind of storm that made you worry about the roof caving in, but it was unsettling. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, the crackling sound, the steady flicker of the flames. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over me like a blanket. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, the feeling of being watched still present, the silence outside occasionally broken by the wind or the sound of something heavy hitting the cabin's roof. It wasn't until the early morning hours that I finally managed to fall into a deep sleep, exhausted from tossing and turning. When I woke up the next day, the sun was already high in the sky. The world outside was bathed in bright, warm sunlight. I felt a little foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. It was just a cabin in the woods. Nothing more, nothing less. I got dressed and decided to go for a walk. Maybe that would clear my head and help me relax. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out the door, the air fresh and cool. The ground was soft underfoot, with a carpet of fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots. The woods around the cabin were dense, but the path was clear. I followed it for a while, admiring the beauty of the place. The trees towered above me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush were the only things I could hear. I walked for about an hour, just taking in the scenery, when I noticed something strange. A faint smell in the air. It was a rotten, decaying kind of smell, like something had been left out in the woods and was slowly rotting. At first, I thought it was just the smell of wet leaves or the remnants of some animal carcass, but the stench was too strong, too persistent. Curious, I decided to follow the scent. It led me off the path, deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of solving the mystery was too tempting. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I kept going, the smell growing stronger as I ventured further. Eventually, I came upon a small clearing. The trees here were more sparse, allowing more sunlight to reach the ground. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a large pile of what looked like rotting leaves and branches. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just that. There was something else buried underneath it all, something that didn't belong in the woods. I stepped closer, my heart starting to race. It was an old, weathered leather bag, half buried in the dirt and leaves. I crouched down and pulled it free, dusting it off as best as I could. It was heavy, much heavier than I expected. I unzipped it, and inside, there were several bundles of what looked like old clothes, wrapped tightly with string. I opened one of the bundles and froze. The clothes inside were stained, old, and covered in dirt. But it wasn't the clothes that made my blood run cold. It was the shape of something hidden inside them. It was a human bone. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. What was this? What had I just found? My pulse quickened as panic set in. I knew I should call the authorities, but part of me wanted to get away from this place as quickly as possible. I didn't want to be involved in whatever this was, but something stopped me, a strange feeling, like the cabin itself had somehow led me to this moment, as if I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. I left the clearing in a hurry, the bag still clutched in my hand. I retraced my steps back to the cabin, my mind spinning with the implications of what I had just found. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want to stay here any longer. I packed my things quickly, throwing them into my bag without even thinking about it. The cabin no longer felt like a peaceful retreat, felt like a trap. Before I could leave, I had one more task. I needed to make sure that the path I had taken into the woods was clear. As I stepped back onto the porch, I saw something that made my heart drop. There, standing in the middle of the yard, was a figure, person, not someone I recognized, just standing there, staring at me. I froze, not sure what to do. I didn't want to confront whoever they were, but I couldn't just leave without knowing what was happening. I watched them for a long moment, and when they finally turned and walked back into the trees, I was struck with an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't until I was already on my way out of the woods, walking back to the car, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I never found out who the person was or what the bag meant, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be coming back to that cabin. The woods held secrets I wasn't ready to uncover, and the peace I had been searching for was nowhere to be found. The whole experience left me with a feeling I couldn't shake, a feeling that something dark and unsettling lingered just beyond the trees, waiting. I woke up early, as the sunlight barely touched the small wooden cabin I had rented for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a break from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I'd been working nonstop, and I needed to clear my mind. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far away from any neighbors. No cars, no noise, just trees, and the occasional chirping of birds. The fresh mountain air felt like a blessing, and I was eager to get the day started. I had packed light, some food, a few books, and a small backpack with essentials. The cabin had everything I needed: an old fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a cozy lofted bed that faced the big window where I could see the trees. It was charming, if a little old. The wooden walls creaked occasionally, but I figured it was just the nature of the place. After all, it was built long before my time. The first morning was peaceful. I spent some time sitting on the small porch, sipping coffee while watching the sun rise over the forest. It felt serene, almost magical, in its quiet simplicity. I had no agenda for the day except to enjoy the solitude. I was looking forward to a hike, but I didn't want to rush. I had the whole weekend. As I finished my coffee, I decided to head out on a trail I had spotted the day before. The map provided by the cabin's owner showed a path that led up to a small hill. It seemed like a good place to explore. I grabbed my jacket and set off, leaving the cabin behind. The air was cooler now, the morning mist still lingering in the shadows of the trees. I followed the trail that wound through the forest, the ground soft and damp beneath my boots. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the only noise, aside from the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the wind. The further I walked, the more isolated I felt. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet. There were no signs of other hikers, no sounds of civilization. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the solitude. After about an hour, I reached the top of the hill, and the view took my breath away. The forest stretched out in every direction, a sea of green that went on forever. I could see the distant peaks of mountains through gaps in the trees. It was the kind of view you only get when you're truly in the wilderness, far away from anything man-made. I stayed up there for a while, letting the silence settle around me. No distractions, no phone service, just nature. It was exactly what I needed. But as I started to make my way back down, I began to notice something strange. A trail of footprints had appeared on the ground. I didn't remember seeing them on my way up. They were fresh, and I could tell they were made by boots similar to mine, though not exactly the same. They were deeper, like someone had been walking heavily, possibly running. I hesitated for a moment, but I didn't feel truly alarmed. I thought maybe someone else had taken the trail earlier, or perhaps I hadn't noticed them before. I continued my walk back to the cabin, but now my mind was wandering. The woods around me felt more alive, more present. I didn't like the feeling, but I brushed it off as my imagination getting the better of me. After all, it was just a trail, right? When I returned to the cabin, I was ready to relax. I made some lunch, a simple sandwich and fruit, then sat by the window, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. As the afternoon wore on, I considered going for another walk, maybe to explore the other side of the cabin. But the nagging feeling from earlier still lingered. I pushed it aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the trees, the atmosphere changed. The wind picked up, and the air grew colder. The light in the cabin dimmed, and I found myself sitting near the fireplace, the only warmth in the room. I was just about to start reading a book when I heard it, a faint knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Who could it be? I stood up slowly, my feet dragging as I approached the door. I wasn't expecting company, and the last thing I wanted was to open it to a stranger. But I did anyway, curiosity getting the best of me. When I opened it, there was no one there, just the empty, darkening forest. I stepped outside onto the porch, my eyes scanning the surrounding woods. The air felt thick now, almost suffocating. The trees stood still, as if they were waiting for something. My instincts screamed at me to go back inside, but I forced myself to stand still for a moment, listening. Everything was quiet again, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed the door and locked it, then drew the curtains tight. I couldn't explain it, but something about the silence outside felt unnatural, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to make dinner and distract myself. I couldn't just sit around thinking about it. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I had no idea who could be out there, but the thought of someone lurking near my cabin sent a chill down my spine. I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would go away. The footsteps continued, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly crept down the stairs, my heart pounding. The light from the flashlight cut through the darkness outside, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no sign of life. I walked around the cabin, my flashlight scanning the area. The woods were eerily still, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, as I was turning to head back inside, I noticed something strange. The trail of footprints I had seen earlier in the day was now clearer, leading directly up to the front porch. The tracks were fresh, the earth still disturbed, as if someone had walked up to the cabin only moments before. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen those tracks earlier. They hadn't been there when I first walked up to the cabin. I scanned the area, but I couldn't see anyone. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. My thoughts were racing. Who could it be? Why would they be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I spent the rest of the night on edge, hearing every small noise, jumping at the slightest sound. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I had hardly slept a wink. I knew I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't willing to find out what it was. I packed up my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag. As I was about to leave, I noticed something on the kitchen table, a small, folded piece of paper. My heart raced as I picked it up, unsure of what to expect. But there was nothing on it, just a single, simple message. Leave now, or it will follow you. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the door, not looking back, and I didn't stop until I was far away from the cabin, out on the main road, where I could see the distant lights of a small town. The air felt lighter, safer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something I didn't want to understand. As I sat in the car, driving away from the cabin, I realized one thing. I would never return to those woods again. Whatever it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. I was lucky to have left when I did, and for the first time in a long time, I truly felt grateful for the ordinary world I had left behind. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon as I pulled my truck into the small gravel driveway of the old cabin. I had been planning this trip for weeks, needing to escape from the busy pace of life and the constant noise of the city. My job had been overwhelming lately, and I just needed time alone to clear my mind. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in the dense woods, and seemed perfect for what I was looking for. The quiet, the solitude, the simple life, no distractions, just me and the nature around me. The cabin itself was a rustic, weather-beaten structure, with peeling wood on the exterior and a sagging porch. It was the kind of place that looked like it had seen better days but still held its charm. It was small, with just a single room, a loft, and a stone fireplace that looked like it could use a good cleaning. I unloaded my gear, grabbing my backpack, sleeping bag, and a few provisions, and made my way to the front door. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way up, and the screen door gave a loud screech when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like old wood and the faint smell of pine. Dust particles floated in the air as I set my things down and took a look around. There was a small kitchen area with an old rusted stove, a table with mismatched chairs, and a single well-worn couch that looked like it had been around for decades. A couple of old wooden chairs were scattered near the stone fireplace. The cabin was far from luxurious, but it had character. After a long day of driving, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. I quickly started a fire in the hearth, the crackling sound of the logs filling the otherwise quiet cabin. The warmth from the fire was soothing as I set up my sleeping bag on the floor in front of the hearth, and I pulled out a book to pass the time. The evening was peaceful, the only sound coming from the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. As the night wore on, the darkness outside grew thicker, and the wind started to pick up. I didn't think much of it at first. The wind had always been strong in these parts, and the trees surrounding the cabin often creaked and groaned in the breeze. But as the wind howled through the trees, I began to hear something else. A faint sound, almost like footsteps crunching in the snow, but it was too warm for snow. I paused, listening. The sound was soft, but distinct, coming from somewhere near the tree line at the edge of the property. I stood up and moved toward the window, peering out into the dark. The moon had risen, casting long shadows over the clearing around the cabin, but I could see nothing unusual. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the brush. I tried to brush it off and went back to my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I decided to turn in for the night. The fire was dying down, and the cabin had grown colder. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. I lay there in the dark, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling, trying to find some comfort in the familiar noises. But then, I heard it again, the soft crunch of footsteps outside. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. My heart started to race as I slowly rose from my sleeping bag and moved toward the window once again. I couldn't see much through the glass, but I could make out the faint outline of the trees swaying in the wind. The footsteps had stopped, and I waited, holding my breath. Silence. For what felt like an eternity, nothing moved. But then, the sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just an animal? Maybe a deer or some other wildlife moving through the woods. But the sound had been too deliberate, too rhythmic. It didn't feel like an animal at all. I could feel the tension in my body as I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, making sure it was working before stepping cautiously toward the door. I tried to remind myself that it was probably nothing, but my gut told me otherwise. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they were too close for comfort. I opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit my skin, and I wrapped my arms around myself to ward off the chill. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the surrounding trees and the clearing in front of the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the distance, but when I focused the light, nothing was there. I took a few more steps down the porch, my eyes scanning the trees. The sound of footsteps had stopped again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I knew the area around the cabin was remote, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Whoever was out here had to have known that. Suddenly, I heard something behind me, a rustling sound, soft but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. But again, there was nothing. The woods were still silent once more. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt different now, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't want to be out here alone anymore. I considered heading back inside, locking the door, and pretending I hadn't heard anything. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving through the trees, not far from where I stood. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my feet pounding the dirt as I reached the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly. My mind was racing. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I couldn't just sit here and wait for them to come to me. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal, but of course, there was none. The isolation of the cabin meant no cell service, no way to reach anyone for help. I was completely on my own. I felt the walls closing in, my thoughts spiraling into panic. There had to be a logical explanation. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining the sounds. I wasn't alone out here. I decided to take a look around the cabin, checking every corner and window. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the rooms, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I checked the back door, the windows, and the loft. Everything seemed fine, but the feeling of unease never left me. Hours passed in a blur. My nerves stretched thin as I kept watch, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The forest outside remained still. The sounds of footsteps vanished. Slowly, the tension in my body began to ease, and I convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe I'd just been too anxious from the isolation. The next morning, I woke up early, the sunlight creeping through the small cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. The air was fresh, and the woods were quiet. I felt a strange sense of relief, the events of the previous night feeling almost like a bad dream. I packed up my things, still feeling unsettled but ready to leave the cabin behind. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. But when I looked around one last time before driving away, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The woods were peaceful, the cabin stood silent, and the world felt still. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind, but I couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. Something about that place had felt wrong, something I couldn't explain. I didn't know who or what had been out there that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be returning anytime soon. As I drove down the narrow road, the trees began to thin out, and I started to feel the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. The feeling of being watched faded, but deep down, I knew that I would never forget the silence of the cabin, the footsteps in the woods, or the unnerving sense that I had been a visitor in a place where I wasn't welcome. By the time I reached the main highway, the sun had risen high above the horizon, casting its warm light on the landscape. It was a beautiful morning, and I was glad to be leaving the woods behind. But in the back of my mind, the memory of that night stayed with me. The fear, the uncertainty, and the lingering question: was I really alone in those woods? I had always loved the idea of being alone in nature, away from everything. That's what drew me to rent a small cabin in the middle of the woods. No phone service, no distractions, just me, a fire, and the sounds of the forest. It seemed perfect. It was supposed to be my escape, a place to get some much-needed rest and relaxation. The cabin itself was a modest wooden structure. It was exactly what you'd picture when you think of a cabin in the woods. A small, single-story building with a porch, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was how isolated it felt. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there were no other cabins in sight. I loved that. It felt like the kind of place where you could lose yourself for a while. The weather was chilly when I arrived, typical for the time of year. The sky was overcast, and there was a slight breeze rustling through the trees. I unpacked my things and made myself comfortable. I didn't bother turning on the lights immediately. The cabin was cozy enough with the dim natural light filtering through the windows. I made a fire in the stone fireplace and sat down with a book, enjoying the warmth. The first few hours were peaceful. I had made myself a simple dinner, and after eating, I spent the evening reading, with the crackling fire as my background music. There was no noise from outside. No cars, no voices, just the quiet of the forest. Felt perfect. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't anything specific. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind howled through the trees outside, and everything seemed fine. Yet, there was this gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like I was being watched, but more like the silence was too thick, too heavy. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a large, soft bed that looked inviting. I had just gotten into bed when I heard it, something tapping against the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the walls. But then the tapping came again, and it was louder this time. It was almost rhythmic, like someone or something was knocking. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart starting to race. The tapping continued for a while, and I started to wonder if maybe an animal had gotten too close to the cabin, scratching at the wood. But this didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate, like it was coming from somewhere far beyond the reach of the wind. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets up around my shoulders and squeezing my eyes shut, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The tapping continued, each knock growing louder and more insistent. It felt like it was right outside my window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to convince myself it was nothing. But the longer it went on, the more my mind raced. I finally decided I couldn't just lay there and listen to it anymore. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously opened the door. The air outside was cold, biting, and the wind had picked up, making the trees sway in the darkness. I shone the light around the cabin but saw nothing. No sign of any animals, no strange shapes in the shadows. Nothing. I stood there for a few moments, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, before I closed the door behind me and went back inside. The tapping stopped as soon as I closed the door. It was as if whatever it was had decided to leave. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just an animal after all, or maybe the wind had been playing tricks on me. Either way, I didn't feel entirely comfortable, but I tried to put it out of my mind. I turned off the flashlight, crawled back into bed, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little uneasy but tried to shake it off. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and everything seemed normal. The woods were calm, and there were no signs of anything strange. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat outside on the porch, watching the sun rise through the trees. Felt peaceful again. But as the day went on, something began to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, just the feeling of being watched, but it grew stronger as the day wore on. Every time I turned my head, I'd see something move out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. The woods were still, quiet, and empty. I spent most of the day outside, hiking around the cabin, trying to clear my mind. The fresh air helped a little, but the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't like I was afraid, but there was something about the place that made me feel on edge. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was something else. By the time evening came, I was ready to call it a day. I returned to the cabin, cooked dinner, and settled in for another quiet night. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the silence of the woods enveloped the cabin again. But this time, I wasn't as calm as I had been the night before. The tapping started again, just as it had the previous night. First, it was faint. Then it grew louder, more rhythmic. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed outside. I scanned the area around the cabin, but there was nothing there. No movement, no signs of anything. The wind had picked up again, and the trees swayed violently, but the tapping, whatever it was, had stopped. I felt stupid for being so paranoid. It was probably just the wind, or maybe a branch was knocking against the cabin. I decided to go inside and try to sleep. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. The tapping continued, but this time it wasn't just on the walls. It was coming from the roof. It was louder now, almost like footsteps. I could feel my pulse racing, and I was certain that I wasn't imagining it. Something was up there. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door again, looking up at the roof. I could barely see anything in the dark, but I heard the sounds coming from above me. My hand was shaking as I held the flashlight. The beam of light caught something in the trees nearby, a shape that was too still, too dark. I couldn't make it out, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The tapping continued for hours, like something was walking across the roof. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, but as I tried to make a call, I realized I had no signal. I was completely cut off. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, not with whatever was on the roof. I grabbed my things and headed out the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't gonna just sit in that cabin and wait for something to happen. I wasn't sure if I was being irrational or if something truly was out there, but I had to leave. I walked as fast as I could, the cold biting at my skin as I made my way down the trail. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I just needed to get away. The woods were silent now, and the only sound was the crunch of the leaves under my feet. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what had been happening. I walked for what felt like hours, the darkness closing in around me. But then, just as I was starting to feel hopeless, I saw lights in the distance. It was a small cabin like the one I had rented. I walked toward it, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I knocked on the door, and when someone answered, I explained everything that had been happening. The people inside were kind enough to let me stay the night. They told me that there had been strange things happening in the area for years, but they weren't sure what it was. Some said it was animals, others said it was just the forest playing tricks on you. The next morning, I returned to the cabin, but when I opened the door, I was relieved to find that everything was just as I had left it. The tapping, the footsteps on the roof, it was all gone. The cabin felt normal again. I stayed another day, but nothing unusual happened. By the time I left, I was able to leave behind all the fears and unease I had experienced. Felt like a weight had been lifted, and as I drove away, I glanced back one last time at the cabin in the woods. Whatever had happened there, I couldn't explain it, but I was glad to be gone. It was a cold, crisp morning when I decided to head out to the cabin. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a break from the chaos of daily life, the constant noise and distractions. The cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. It wasn't a fancy place. It was old and rustic, a bit worn out, but that's what drew me to it. No electricity, no cell service, just the sound of the trees and the occasional animal. The silence had its charm. I packed my things in my car, making sure I had everything I needed. I wasn't going for too long, just a weekend, but I wanted to be prepared. I had some food, blankets, a few books, and a couple of flashlights. It was a good 5-hour drive to get there, but I was used to the long road trips, especially when I was escaping the city. The drive was peaceful, the kind where the road stretched for miles and the only thing you could hear was the hum of the engine. The further I drove, the fewer people I saw, and eventually, the trees started closing in around me. It was almost like the world had shrunk, and I was the only person left in it. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the clearing. I parked the car and grabbed my bags. The cabin was just a small structure, tucked away in the middle of the woods. It looked exactly like I had remembered from the pictures. Wooden walls, a steep roof covered in moss, and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. It wasn't much, but it felt like it had character, like it had been standing there for decades, weathering the seasons, witnessing everything the forest had to offer. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and old furniture. It was clean, though, and the fireplace in the corner was already stocked with logs, ready to go. The small kitchen had a simple stove and a sink, and there was a table with 4 chairs. The living area was small but cozy, with a couch and a couple of armchairs around a stone fireplace. The large windows offered a stunning view of the forest, and the walls were lined with old photographs and paintings, all giving the place a homely, rustic vibe. I spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in. I started a fire in the fireplace, which crackled and popped as it came to life. The warmth of the fire felt good against the cool evening air. I made myself a simple dinner, some soup and bread, and sat at the table, enjoying the peace and quiet. No one to bother me, no emails, no notifications. Just the sound of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind outside. As the night went on, I started to feel more relaxed. The forest outside was quiet, too, the kind of silence that felt deep and almost reverent. It wasn't the kind of silence that made you nervous, but the kind that made you feel small, like you were a part of something bigger. I couldn't explain it, but it was comforting. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the cabin, just to stretch my legs. The night was clear, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was chilly, but the walk felt good. The crunch of dry leaves underfoot was the only sound, and the further I walked, the more it felt like I was stepping into a different world. There was no one around for miles, and it felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I wandered for a while, taking in the beauty of the night, the way the trees seemed to stretch up forever, their branches reaching for the sky. After about an hour, I turned back, heading back to the cabin. The walk had been peaceful, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. But as I approached the cabin, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange stillness in the air. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, had stopped. It was completely silent now, and I could hear my own footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. When I reached the door, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I left. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to reason with myself. Maybe I had just forgotten to shut it all the way. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I pushed the door open slowly, the old wood creaking in protest. The inside of the cabin was exactly as I had left it, but the air felt different now. The warmth of the fire seemed to have disappeared, and a chill had settled in. I checked the fireplace. It was still burning, but the flames were smaller now, as if they had been left unattended for a while. The logs were still there, but they weren't burning as brightly as they should. I walked through the cabin, checking every corner, every window, every door. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of unease grew with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. It was ridiculous, I told myself. I was just being paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. I decided to lock the door and head to bed. I turned off the lights and crawled under the thick blankets, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, made my heart race. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until I heard the sound that I finally sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a soft, almost inaudible noise, but it was unmistakable. A tapping sound, coming from the window. I got out of bed, trying to move quietly, but my feet were heavy on the wooden floor. I approached the window cautiously, my breath catching in my throat as I pulled back the curtains. There was nothing outside, nothing but the dark forest. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the blackness, my mind racing. Could it have been an animal? Maybe a branch tapping against the window in the wind? I couldn't be sure, but the sound had been too clear to ignore. I spent the rest of the night awake, my mind running in circles. Every sound outside, every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination, that nothing was wrong, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. The sun had risen, casting a pale light over the forest. I felt like I hadn't slept at all, but the day was here, and I needed to shake off the anxiety of the night before. I decided to go for another walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The woods were peaceful in the daylight. The sun filtered through the trees, and the birds had started singing again. I walked for a while, trying to get my thoughts in order. But as I walked, something caught my eye. A small, twisted branch lay on the ground, just off the path. It didn't look like it belonged there. It wasn't just any branch, it was too clean, too new looking. And when I picked it up, it was too smooth, like it had been placed there on purpose. I tossed the branch aside, but the unease I had been feeling the night before crept back into my mind. I looked around, trying to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. I kept walking, faster now, hoping to outrun it. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was ready to leave. The forest had lost its charm. The silence had become oppressive, and the cabin, once so welcoming, now felt like a trap. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking as I loaded my car. The thought of staying another night was unbearable. I couldn't explain it, but something about that place, about the woods, felt wrong. As I drove away, The cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror. The road stretched out before me, and the silence of the forest faded behind me. I didn't look back. The feeling of unease still lingered, but I knew I was leaving it behind. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and as I neared the city, the familiar sounds of traffic and life returned. I felt the weight of the last few days lift off my shoulders. The cabin, the woods, the strange occurrences, they were all behind me now. But every so often, I still think about it. The tapping at the window, the twisted branch, the sense of being watched. I can't shake the feeling that something had been there, something that I couldn't see, something that wasn't human. And maybe that's why I never went back. Maybe some things are better left unexplained.